I guess we'll bring this June 22nd meeting, our first interim meeting for the Select Committee on School Facilities to order. Could we have a roll call, please?
Yes, sir. Senator Hutchings.
Excused?
She is online.
She's online, okay. Then she's
Senator
here.
Cost.
Present.
Senator Landon.
Here.
Senator Rothfuss.
Here.
Representative Banks.
Here.
Representative Harshman. Representative Jennings. Representative Walters.
Here.
Vice Chairman Brown.
Here.
Chairman Pappas.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. As you heard, and for the folks out there in the online, we do have a problem with our Zoom link, and so those of you who have signed up to testify, there will be a change, hopefully, when they repair the Zoom link. But for right now, you can watch us on the YouTube feed. Senator Hutchings, welcome. Also, I'd ask everyone to please silence their cell phones or any device that may make some noise, and we'll get started. Thank you. I want to express, first of all, my thanks to everyone who made the tours that we had yesterday a reality. It was great for me, and for those of the committee members. I think they were able to see some issues, some good schools, some schools that were challenged, and that was the intent of the tours. I thank Superintendent Jennings and his staff and his team, LSO and the department. Thank you for facilitating that, and a couple of the commissioners who joined us. That was great to have you with us. So I just want to thank everyone for that. And with that, I actually would like if someone from the department would take over the microphone to our commissioners who are here today. I'd like to have them introduce themselves. We're sure pleased that you're with us today. So thank you. Yeah, we have a wireless mic somewhere. Okay. We could bring them. There's 4 chairs. We could bring them up front. Well, welcome. Please.
You look familiar.
Oh, yeah, you look familiar too. So I'll let you, in any order you want to, please tell us who you are, what sector you represent, and where you're from.
I'm Joni Kashelhofer. I represent District 6. I live in Newcastle, so I have Weston Crook and Niobrara counties for my area.
Janet Anderson. I'm from Cheyenne in that district down there in southeast section, and looking forward to this meeting.
I'm Mike Gilmore, and I'm from Casper, and I represent Natrona and Fremont County.
And I'm Jack Tarter. I'm District 4, Sheridan Johnson and Campbell County. I'm the new kid on the block, so, but I was born and raised in Casper, so.
Well, great, thank you. And for the 2 of you that were on our tours, any observations that you might have for us from our tours yesterday?
Well, I can tour them a little bit because when I was a kid, I went to a lot of these schools here. And so Park, we used to go there every Wednesday night and play basketball in a church league. And I worked for the schools in the old days. We had a storeroom that was in the basement of the old junior high that was here. And I was telling some of them today, just a cute story, that we had a lady we worked for named Nora Ringel, and she was the head of the storeroom, and she made a mistake one time, and she ordered 2 boxcar loads of toilet paper. And there's a spur right here where this building is, and we had the boxcars were right here. And we unloaded them, and they all went under the stadium at the NCHS Stadium. So just a little light humor there. So
Yeah.
needless to say, I never had a high respect for toilet paper after that, so.
Eventually, it was all used.
Yeah, that's great.
I am next to Jack, the second newest kid on the block, and I was just excited to get to see the schools on the ground, because when I came on board, it's COVID and we're in shutdown and not traveling. And so I really appreciated just getting to see what people have done with old schools. You know, there's hope for old schools. It's somewhat reassuring that we don't necessarily have to look at rebuilding every school that's 50 years old. There are things that we can do to make our dollars go further. And I appreciated the innovation and the looking to the future that the schools are doing. It was just a really interesting day. And I thank everybody for making that happen.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for attending our meeting. It's always great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say thank you to the 4 of you and your entire commission for all of the hard work you guys do to put together a great system for getting schools rebuilt, getting schools improved, for allocating major maintenance money and tracking all of that. You guys do an outstanding job. All of us would be lost if it wasn't for the hard work you do. The legislature occasionally might add a thing or two to your project list, but we always accept all of the projects that you recommend and move forward with those. And it's the hard work you folks do, and I can't say thank you enough, but I wanted to say thank you publicly today for all of your hard work, and you do an outstanding job.
And I have to echo that. You know, as a former commissioner myself, I know how much work you put in, and sometimes have to put up with a lot of folks who, even legislators, who sometimes can be difficult, and so it is a difficult job. So thank you. I do have to applaud you for all your hard work. Thank you. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I wanted to send a shout out to Commissioner Gilmore this morning. Appreciate all your service and appreciate you being here this morning, Mike. I understand that your bride has been in the hospital for a little bit, and former Representative Gilmore. And so our hearts are with her, and I hope you'll share that with her. And I tell her we appreciate her sharing you with us. So thanks, Mike. I just wanted to give you a salute for that. We're thinking about her, and thanks to all of you for the work you do.
Well, thank you, Bill.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Janet.
One comment, I mean, I appreciate your compliments of the commission, and we do a lot of work, but the real backbone of all the work is done by the department. Some of them are here, and you'll hear from them. Those guys are phenomenal. And they're our number crunchers. So thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, I do want to make, you're welcome to please go back into the audience, and
Our corner.
we'll bring up we'll bring up some hard workers. First of all, I'd like to recognize Representative Bill Henderson, who's in the audience. Bill, welcome. Glad to have you with us today. And former, I have to introduce our former department chairman, Dell. Glad to have you here as well. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Matt, I think you're first on board. We're going to discuss our first item, school facilities end of session summary. You all should have read his report in the materials, but Matt, if you'll take us through that. And I don't know, Tanya, are you going to have part of this as well? No, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Matt Wilmarth, LSO Senior School Finance Analyst. This is meeting item number 2-01 in your meeting materials. And this is a summary of the 2022 budget session related to K-12 school capital construction. Just this purpose is really just kind of remind you what you did about 6 months ago. It's kind of hard to realize it's been that long. If you recall, during your last interim, this committee sponsored one piece of legislation. And the purpose of that legislation was to codify the process to transfer funds from the school lands mineral royalties account, which captures revenues from state school lands, mineral royalty revenues, and then also distribute the investment earnings from the SIPA to this sub-account for school major maintenance. Historically and traditionally, those have been done through the budget bill. It takes action of your legislature to transfer those funds. So the purpose of House Bill 34 was to just codify that to allow the state auditor to do that automatically. The second kind of big piece in that piece of legislation, which I think may be the reason why the bill did not get enacted into law, was related to the Wyoming State Penitentiary capital construction account. And this would have suspended any transfers to that account, which is $10 million per year. And then it would have taken that $10 million and transferred it to the school capital construction account through fiscal year 38 and or 2038. As I indicated, this piece of legislation was not enacted into law, but I wanted to remind the committee of what that purpose of the bill was. In response to the bill failing, the Joint Appropriations Committee this interim is taking up the concept of streamlining the transfers of the school land minerals royalty account and the SIPA major maintenance sub-account. I have linked within this memo in footnote 2 the background paper that LSO put together for the Joint Appropriations Committee. They were scheduled to take up that topic at their first meeting in June, but they ran out of time to address that issue. So I'll keep the committee apprised of that work on Joint Appropriations side, and keep this committee apprised of any changes related to those processes. Any questions related to that bill?
Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Matt, thanks for the reminder. That's really helpful for us older guys. I had a thought that I wanted to throw out and maybe get your thoughts back on it. Especially in the mode that we've moved into in our school facilities work, our commission. We've kind of moved into this asset preservation mode. It's almost, it makes it kind of difficult when we go to session to talk about the school capital construction account. And that's really a little bit of a misnomer. And I wonder, the former chairman sits on appropriation. I just wonder if we shouldn't continue every time we get a chance to remind our colleagues in the legislature that account is far more than just building a new building. It's not a capital construction account. Quite frankly, it's more of a major maintenance and taking care of buildings account. So it's almost like the select committee might want to think about renaming, what we even call that thing. But I don't know. Just wanted to throw that out before we left the topic.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Landon, I think that's a great segue to my second portion of this memo. You're right, the school capital construction account it has appropriations more than just for school capital construction. It appropriates funds to the state construction department for the operations of the school facilities division, the department staff, and the school facilities commission. In addition, you're right, the majority of the appropriations out of the account currently are related to major maintenance. And so the naming of the account has been there for some time, 20 plus years. it's just the name. Legislature has the ability to change it if it wants to rename its purpose.
Any other questions? Representative Harshman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, just to kind of remind the committee too, I mean, these two changes really with the royalty account and the 45% of the SIPA, and we guarantee the SIPA now with the reserve account. So it's, remind the committee, I mean, this all occurred during the last downturn, 17, 18, and when coal lease bonus money disappeared. So we're talking about $100 million roughly, about 40, 45 million each or so out of these, just remind us, and then another follow-up after that.
Sure. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Representative Harshman's comments are good in that the school land mineral royalties account was a newly created account to collect state mineral royalties on school lands. And this was done, I believe, in the 2020 session or the 2019 session. And it's been in effect for this first biennium, the 21-22 biennium. Representative Harshman's comments on coal lease bonus revenue is important in that historically the school capital construction account's primary revenue source was federal coal lease bonus revenues. And those have essentially gone away. There is no revenue forecast to be collected from that revenue source. So two responses from the legislature to supplement that revenue loss were, first, the state's constitution allows up to 1/3 of state mineral royalties to be appropriated for the purpose of schools. That could be for the operations or major maintenance capital construction, but it has to be for K-12 schools. Historically, the school capital construction account collected, or $8 million was distributed to the school capital construction account from school mineral royalties. In 2018.
Just to, Mr. Chairman, just to interrupt on that. So that school capital, the Constitution says 1/3 shall be distributed, but some legislator back in the 1990s put 1/3, but they put in statute not to exceed 8 million. That's the part
Mr. Chairman, Representative Harshman, that's correct. So while the Constitution allows up to 1/3 to be used for purposes of schools, the legislature put a cap of that amount not to exceed $8 million annually. So for many years, the school capital construction account was limited to only $8 million of that revenue source. The remainder went to the corpus of the common school account. So in 2018, the legislature, in response to the decrease in and elimination of federal coal lease bonus revenues, increased that or eliminated the $8 million cap and allowed the full 1/3 to be deposited in the school capital construction account. Along with that change, a new account, the school land mineral royalties account, was created to collect that revenue beginning in the fiscal year 21-22 biennium. So that allowance of the full 1/3 to be distributed for school capital construction purposes allowed about $45 million more revenue for this current biennium to be distributed for purposes of school capital construction. So on the school capital construction side for next biennium, we're anticipating $64 million to be collected. Under this current biennium, it's going to be approximately $55 million. And I'll get into that in my final comments on this memo. The second piece that the legislature responded to in response to the elimination of federal coal lease bonus revenues was to allocate or distribute investment earnings from the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund that are distributed to the Strategic Investments Projects account, the SIPA. The SIPA receives 1.25% guaranteed of investment earnings on a 5-year average, or the spending policy on the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund. So 1.25% is distributed to the SIPA. Of that 1.25% of the spending policy, 45% is then transferred to the school capital construction account. It goes to a sub-account within the SIPA, but in layman's terms, it's going to the school capital construction account. For a biennial amount, that equates to about $98 million for next biennium. So about $50 million per year, a little less than that. And that'll increase as the corpus of the permanent environmental trust fund or the spending policy increases. So we made up about, for the biennium, about $165 million with those two changes. It does not replace the large amounts from federal COLI bonus revenues. And that was about $2 billion over about 16 years.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up then.
Representative
So
Henderson.
that's about a half-cent sales tax. I mean, if you looked at it that way, I mean, that we found through revenue streams. But I think my last question really, and then a comment, the key, I think, though, is this is profiled when we do budget work, right? It's not any of that where it's not profiled till the Appropriations Committee approves it.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Harshman, correct. We, LSO profiles both the SIPA and the mineral royalty revenue to the school capital construction account.
Very good. And I think just members of this committee, I think as this moves to appropriations as a interim topic, if this is something you really is important to you, I think I'd talk to your fellow appropriators. I think, I've had I think the key though is it's profiled. That's the key. And we're building the budget off of profiled money. And then for another committee to not accept that gets a little harder. So.
Yeah, it has to be understood, though, that in doing all of that, we are not building that corpus like we were.
I missed, yeah, that's right. Except that we've changed now. We've got the 1% statutory severance flowing back to the corpus, and we've got half of that now going to the common school account, and then eventually 1/3. So that'll make up for that.
Not totally, right?
Well, it's pretty significant, I think.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe the severance tax, the additional 1.5% of severance tax will go, or 1/2 of the 1% severance tax will go to the common school account. I believe that is about $50 million per year. I will double check that when I go back, but. Yeah.
And that's 50 million per year compared to the about 40 million per biennium of the.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it might be
Thank
50 million a biennium. I will confirm that. We have it on the Craig tables. I'll get a firm amount on that.
Okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, within the 2022 budget bill, these transfers were provided for. So the state auditor will make these transfers in the 23-24 biennium. That was section 300C within the budget bill. So on the appropriations side, the legislature appropriated $245.4 million for K-12 school capital construction and major maintenance. $86.4 million related to capital construction and $159 million related to major maintenance. And this is for the next biennium. In addition, as I indicated, the school capital construction account does appropriate funding for the operations of the commission, the department staff, and any other engineering and technical costs. That was $12.1 million for the 23-24 biennium. So in total, those three categories and the total appropriations from the school capital construction account was $257.5 million last session. I think this afternoon the department may have some updates on maybe a supplemental budget request or projects that might be coming forward. I will note I've been working with them on the major maintenance estimates for this year and next year. It looks like based upon the values of their cost replacement values of buildings and the RS means values that are used, that major maintenance will increase significantly. And a supplemental budget request of about $9 million will likely be coming. Mr. Chairman, just to reiterate that $9 million is likely be a supplemental budget request for major maintenance. And that has nothing to do with increased square footage or students. It's all related to inflationary costs on construction. And so I think the department can speak to that and any other items that they anticipate to bring forward to the commission and the committee. On page 2 of my memo, I've outlined, I won't go through each of these projects, but I wanted to remind the committee of what projects were appropriated for. The one item I will note, of the $86.4 million, about $8.7 million was appropriated effective immediately for the current biennium. And those were for projects that experienced inflationary pressures. And that was in Cheyenne, Laramie County School District number 1, their elementary school, and then Lincoln County School District number 1 and Lincoln County School District number 2. Finally, Mr. Chairman, so while there's $257.5 million appropriated from the school capital construction account, the legislature had to make up about $65 million in revenue to buttress the school capital construction account. The forecast revenue for the next biennium, again, forecast revenue, and really the only fluctuation will be related to school mineral royalties. So the $65 million came from 3 separate accounts. The first is from the School Foundation Program Reserve Account, approximately $4 million. That balance will be transferred to the school capital construction account. The SIPA, in addition to the 45% of the investment earnings, an additional $14.7 million will be transferred from the SIPA to the school capital construction account. And then another $46 million from the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account, the LSRA, will be transferred to the school capital construction account to buttress the anticipated difference between dedicated revenues and appropriations.
Matt, when are those transfers made?
Good question, Mr. Chairman. The transfers are made within the 23-24 biennium, but it's at intervals as determined by the state auditor to ensure cash flow of the school capital construction account. So the state auditor has the ability to transfer those when she sees the balance of the account needing those funds, but it'll occur throughout the biennium, not all at once.
Okay, thank you.
And then, Mr. Chairman, my final comment in this memo, the last sentence, I think is important. The revenues for the statement of royalties, they're forecast and they're volatile. And so I checked yesterday before we hit the road, the revenues to be deposited for this current fiscal year 22, into the school land mineral royalties account are, as I indicated, pacing ahead of the January 2022 forecast by about $5.5 million. So what that does is it will increase the beginning balance of the 23-24 biennium. So while we anticipate a $536 million balance in the school capital construction account at the end of the 23-24 biennium, in October's, Craig, and LSO fiscal profile, you'll see an additional approximately $5.5 million more than what we had forecast in January. There's an additional about $500,000 in other revenues from investment earnings on the school capital construction account itself and capital construction infrastructure recapture agreements with school districts that'll be accounted for as well. So about $6 million will be added to the beginning balance of the 23-24 biennium. As of yesterday, there may be more revenues from state mineral royalties collected in the next 8 days to be deposited in the school land mineral royalties account and then transferred to the school capital construction account. But I wanted to apprise the committee of that. I still caution the ending balance of the $536,000. Again, October, the consensus revenue estimating group will reforecast the state mineral royalties to be deposited in the school land mineral royalties account. Currently, those prices for oil, natural gas, and Craig will influence, but the key factor is the location of that production. And so we'll reevaluate that forecast. I don't know if it'll go up or down or stay the same, But if anything that influences that into the binding balance, it'll be the forecast of the statement of royalties. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll take any additional questions related to this topic.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Representative Brown.
Matt, just curious, I just want to make sure I got, you mentioned two different numbers, and I want to make sure I understood what number is. And the only reason I'm really truly asking is it looks like there may be a slight typo on the second to last line. It says 536,000, but you did say 536 million at one point. And so I want to make sure that we're good there. And then, so just if you can tell me exactly what our beginning balance is expected to be.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, apologize for the misstatement there. The estimated ending balance today, as of June 30th, 2024, under the LSO fiscal profile is 536,000, not million. It's anticipated that it'll increase on the LSO on paper by about $5.5 million related to the statement of royalties from fiscal year 2022. Those have not been appropriated but they're just pacing ahead of current forecast. But again, I will caution that any balance could be further modified based upon any additional changes from the October 2022 Craig related to statement of royalties.
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you had said there might be a $9 million supplemental request with 536,000 as an ending balance June 30th. We would be looking for 8.5 million, rough number, of some other funding source in the supplemental budget to meet that need. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Walters, that's correct. And 5.5 million or a little bit more could be tapped from fiscal year 22 ending balance or beginning balance revenues. So then you're looking for just a differential on the $4.5 million. And that is only related to major maintenance. There may be other capital construction projects or component level projects or emergency requests, inflationary requests that come through the commission and department. So you're right. Another account will have to be accessed, whether it's the general fund or LSRA or SIPA. I think the SIPA is actually already expended, but some other revenue source will have to be accessed if the legislature chooses to make additional appropriations.
Follow up?
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The school foundation program account, is it pacing about break even, or are we still about 60 million behind? If we were to tap it to do some of this major maintenance and new capital construction, what would that picture look like? Briefly.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Walters, that's a more difficult question to answer right now. On paper, for the end of this fiscal year, end of the biennium, the LSO profile anticipates a transfer from the LSRA to the school foundation program account to leave an ending balance of $100 million of approximately $236 million. However, that does not account for additional federal mineral royalties related to fiscal year 22 that are pacing ahead of forecast revenues. Additionally, for the fiscal year 23-24 biennium, you will have non-mineral assessed valuation amounts on the 43 school mill levies that will be ahead of the January 2022 forecast revenues. It is likely that just that piece of the non-mineral assessed valuation will take care of any anticipated shortfall or transfer from the LSRA just for the fiscal year 23-24 biennium. So housing valuations are a majority of that difference or reason for the increased revenues. That doesn't even begin to address the fiscal year 23-24 biennial revenues from mineral related assessed valuation, for which pricing on oil, natural gas, and coal are ahead of January Craig forecast revenues. So I don't know what that will be, what the impact of that will be. We'll know more in October.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Rothfuss.
On the valuation of the minerals themselves, when that assessment is done, I'll just ask, when is that assessment official, so to speak, and how does the calculation take into consideration cost differentials over the time period of the assessed valuation?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, the legislature changed the schedule for mineral ad valorem taxes to a monthly mineral ad valorem tax payment schedule. There are a few counties, Sublette County and Lincoln County, that had some of their mineral taxpayers remain on the old schedule, but it's a small percentage in comparison to total assessed valuation. So production of January of 2022 on all minerals was paid by the taxpayers to the Department of Revenue in April. Then the Department of Revenue remitted that to each county, and the county then remitted it to their taxing districts the following month. So it's essentially about a 3 to 4 month delay from production to actual receipt of those funds in each of the counties or school districts or the state.
Mr. Chairman, then at that point, yeah, instantaneous valuation at production with a slight, we're about 3-month lag now based on the way that we've rescheduled that. Okay, thank you.
Further questions? Hey, Matt, does that wrap up?
Mr. Chairman, that is the
Wrap up your,
that's the rest of my comments on this memo.
okay, then.
And Mr. Chairman, if there's any public comment,
Yes,
I'll stand aside.
I'm going to open it for public comment on the end of session summary that we just heard. So if anybody would like to speak to that, please, Janine, come forward. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Janine Bateski from Teton County. I'm a school board trustee. I just want to take off on one comment that Matt made, which is about the non-mineral assessed valuation. We are projecting right now that our assessed valuation and our recapture payment is going to quickly approach what our block grant is at $53 million. So assessed value, he's absolutely correct. Assessed valuations are going out of the park. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comment? Seeing none, I'll close public comment for this section. Don't see a hand online either. We don't have anyone online. Okay. All right. So then let's move on to our next topic, maintenance funding for K-12 school facilities. Matt, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This item comes to the committee as its priority number 2 related to the review of the major maintenance calculation, any amount that can be utilized to maintain local enhancements, and then the replacement value percentage utilized for that calculation. Also within that priority is a review of the routine maintenance resources that are allocated through the K-12 Education Resource Block Grant Model. This is meeting item number 3-01 in your meeting materials as well. Mr. Chairman, in kind of a more simplistic explanation of the calculation, major maintenance is the allowable square footage under the statutes and rules of the commission times a cost of that gross square footage, and then it's multiplied by 2% to identify the major maintenance amount. That's a very simplistic explanation of what that calculation is. The state is required to provide for the maintenance.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you,
Representative
Mr. Chairman.
Walters.
Just for the committee's edification, would you explain what allowable square footage equates to, or are you going to get to that eventually?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, in Representative Walters, I will get to that. It varies whether it's educational space or non-educational space on what the allowable square footage is. So I'll get into the details of that. So, Mr. Chairman, as I indicated, as part of the legislature's charge to maintain a complete and uniform system of public construction, the state is required to finance not only the capital construction, but the maintenance of the facilities. There have been some changes in the scheduling of the major maintenance payments over the past couple years. Before the 2018 session change, major maintenance payments were made in lump sum on July 1 of every year. In the 2018 session, the legislature modified that schedule to allow 75% to be distributed to school districts and the remaining 25% to be distributed at the end of September. The legislature further modified that change in 2019 to just do quarterly payments beginning on July 1 of each year. Part of the reason or the impetus of the change in 2018 was the statute required data from the prior school year to be utilized. But the issue was on July 1, the prior school year ADM was never known from the Department of Education. So the delay of the 25% in September allowed for the adjudication of that data from school districts, and then the school major maintenance formula was able to utilize proper ADM data. The change of the quarterly payments was really just a cash flow issue to the school capital construction account. As I indicated earlier, the school capital construction account is now being supplemented or buttressed from other accounts. The federal COLIS bonus revenues went away, and so the revenue stream into the school capital construction account was not as robust as it previously was. So that's kind of the backstory on why the scheduling change occurred.
So if you can answer this question, and maybe it's a question I need to pose to the department. The quarterly payments, how are districts, do we have any experience on how districts are able to, I mean, sometimes your maintenance projects, you need those dollars early, especially in the summer, to get work done. So if we have to wait till October and December and April or whenever the payments are, have we had any issues from the districts?
Mr. Chairman, I have not been advised of any issues with the change in the scheduling. I would just note each district is allowed to carry over its total balance annually of their major maintenance fund. So it is not the cap or the balance of that amount is not restricted in terms of how much it can be. So school districts can carry over as much money as they have in their major maintenance accounts year over year.
Assuming they're not using it.
Mr.
I
Chairman,
mean, I'm assuming they're probably needing to use this money.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And I don't know what the balance was last year, but I know it was a substantial amount in total across school districts of the total major maintenance amount. Then they get a quarter on top of that each quarter of the year. But you are correct. If a district has a substantial project going on, they may need a cash flow.
Was there any latitude in the statute to allow the department to provide some of the funding if there was some project that they were looking at doing that required maybe 50% of it to be in the first month, in the first quarter?
Mr. Chairman, no.
No, there's no latitude. Okay, thank you. Representative, not representative, Senator
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Rothfuss.
And one thing we've talked about in the past with regard to the cash flow was the idea that a lot of these projects to benefit from the full construction season really need their funding, whatever's being released earlier. And I don't know if we've really done a very good job of addressing that yet. I don't think we have, unless we explicitly have in the budget, which I know we've done at certain times, releases of funds for projects to get them upon signature of the budget rather than waiting for July 1. But I think the way that we've got the cash flow at this point in time for major maintenance projects kind of reduces the value through the inflation that's going to occur over the winter. Is that accurate, or am I missing something that we've got in place that helps us to remedy that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, I think there's maybe two separate responses here. The first is for school capital construction, it's been done multiple ways. There have been projects appropriated for either design or construction immediately, effective immediately. And I pointed out a couple of those inflationary appropriations from this most recent session were effective immediately. The other appropriations were effective July 1 of 2022. The supplemental budget is always effective immediately, so those are always appropriated effective immediately unless it's specified otherwise. Related to major maintenance, again, I defer, there is a substantial, and I think it's around $50+ million in total of school district major maintenance reserves. Then in addition, they get a quarter of their annual payment in July. So school districts major maintenance reserves carry over without a cap year over year. So if they are planning to do a project, I anticipate they're keeping some of their major maintenance dollars allocated for a specific building and building up a reserve for that project as they plan that through their facility planning process. So that one's a little bit more different. Certainly the legislature could modify the schedule again if they wanted, but part of the reason or the impetus of that change was the pressure on the school capital construction account. There is a provision in, as I indicated in the budget bill, to allow the state auditor to cash flow at times that it deems necessary for the transfers from the LSRA and the School Foundation Program Reserve account. But the SIPA revenues that flow in the school mineral royalties are at infrequent times. They're not, we don't receive all $230 million or $245 million in revenue to the school capital construction account on July 1. And so if you put more pressure on the school capital construction account for major maintenance payments to be made sooner, it puts the school capital construction account at a position to borrow or interfund borrow from the LSRA or some other account that legislature deems. So.
Mr. Chairman, and follow up, yeah, I guess I think the most important aspect of that probably is the reserve capacity to cash flow and start projects early, assuming that, and I think all districts are probably in a situation where they would be okay with that. I guess I'd just ask maybe if there is any circumstance where that's a problem, I'd like to hear about it, but I see where that is probably taken care of. It. If I'm anticipating my major maintenance coming and I have a project that needs to get done a little ahead of that, I should be able to cash flow it out of my reserve and then offset it with the payment that's coming. And if it works, if it's working that way, I think we're probably okay.
And Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, I had in a response to Chairman Paps's question, I have not heard any issues on cash flow of major maintenance, which is somewhat a little bit different than we've heard on the operations side from the block grant on the limitation of 15% or increase to 30%.
And the only thing I would have liked to have seen, I think we did okay by allowing or instituting the quarterly payments, but I would have liked to have seen some flexibility for circumstances that the department may deem necessary. These hard and fast, thou shalt only get a quarter now and then, but sometimes they, prudent for inflationary reasons, there's a lot of reasons. Right. Construction dollars will cost more if we wait to build up the reserve, so there's, I just wish we had a little more flexibility in the statute. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 2 of this issue brief, I outline the school year 21-22's major maintenance payment and the statewide allowable gross square footage for each category. So in total, educational square footage allowed under the formula was about $18.6 million. That generated approximately $68 million in revenue. There's a mothballed category for buildings that are mothballed. That was a total of 153,519 gross square feet, which generated a minor amount of $56,000 in major maintenance funding. The allowable office and warehouse square footages was about 2.2 million gross square feet in total, and about $6.7 million in funding. So total square footage financed under the major maintenance formula was just under 21 million gross square feet, and was about 75, and it equated to about $75 million. So as we get into this allowable square footage, I wanted to first discuss the educational building gross square footage. And this is contemplated under statute, under the statute 2115-109, subsection C. And again, I kind of put a figure on there of how that is calculated. We look at the total actual non-portable, so non-modular square footage, and we subtract out any leased square footage that a school district has in their facilities, and any locally enhanced square footage. And then that is the educational square footage that is non-portable. Then we add in any portable buildings or modular buildings to the educational building square footage. There is a limitation in statute that the portable or modular educational square footage cannot exceed 10% of a district's entire gross square footage. No district has actually met this threshold. All districts get funded for their modular or portable buildings. But I did want to highlight that there is a limitation on how much portable building square footage would be funded if a district exceeded that 10% threshold. So that is the total educational square footage. That then that gets
So Matt,
some.
can I have a question? That 18.5 for the allowable square footage is in comparison to the 23.1 gross square footage that you mentioned a little bit further below. Is the difference there enhanced square footage? Or what is that difference?
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, great question. So the first stage is to identify the actual square footage. And that is that total, so the actual square footage between non-portable and portable is $23.2 million. However, the formula limits how much will be paid, and that is compared against an allowable square footage. And the allowable square footage has two calculations. The first is that each building's type, whether it's an elementary, middle, high school, or a junior high school, a 612 school, a K-12 school, alternative school, all have allowable square footage calculations under the commission's methodology based upon the number of students that building serves. So, for example, yesterday's Park Elementary School that was toured has 360 students enrolled in that. The allowable square footage will be based upon the 360 students as an elementary school. School districts, so we calculate each building's, or the department or commission will calculate the allowable square footage based upon last year's ADM, the prior year's ADM for each school building. The second piece of this allowable square footage calculation is that then that allowable square footage is multiplied by 115%. We sum up each district's total actual square footage and compare it to 115% of their allowable square footage. And districts get the lesser of those two amounts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, how did the 115% get, how'd that come about?
Mr. Chairman, there is some history to this, both on the K-12 operations side and on the K-12 major maintenance side. This all came out of the Campbell cases, and maybe Tanya can kind of talk about this.
Yeah.
But in kind of big picture terms, The legislature, once it took control of financing capital construction, was required to identify adequate space for education. So it came up with these allowable, it charged the School Facilities Commission at the time to determine what is an allowable or adequate level of square footage for each type of building. Knowing and realizing districts were responsible for building schools prior to then, the legislature and the state recognized in some instances, districts had way more square footage than what was allowed under their new calculations. So the legislature, as part of its charge to kind of decrease that excess square footage, set a threshold of allowing up to 135% of square footage to be allocated for both operations and K-12 operations and major maintenance calculations. And it ratcheted it down over time from 135, 125, and then it's stayed flat at 115% square footage for some time. It's been about 18, 20 years, somewhere around there. So districts have had this limitation on their square footage. And I believe the theory or the hope was that districts, as they go through construction and renovation of buildings and the state takes over the program, they would be built to these new adequacy standards, and that excess square footage would fall off over time. Additionally, in districts' cases where they want to enhance square footage for a larger auditorium or larger CTE program, that's okay, that's a local enhancement, but it's not going to be funded for purposes of major maintenance or operations.
Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, thank you. It actually leads to something I wanted to ask you about. Yesterday, we ran into a couple of situations where it was indicated that local enhancement space had to be implemented in order to complete the renovation, particularly at Park, for example. And I'm speaking about a hallway that allowed for them to route traffic out and around the gymnasium during a lunchroom situation or whatever. Seemed to make perfect sense to me. If we were going to take a look at that particular piece, would we do so in statute, or is that just simply methodology in the commission's hands?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, I think it's a case-by-case basis. And I'll have to defer to the department of the commission, but I believe they have the ability on a case-by-case basis to exempt what they deem under their current rules an enhancement. So I think the legislature has to be a little bit careful in maybe a wholesale change in, hey, adding classroom, that's not an enhancement. I think that could be dealt with at the commission level, because in instances of a district enhancing square footage for a larger auditorium or a CTE program that's above what was allocated under their calculator when they built a new school, are you then going to allow those additional square feet to count as educational space as well? An enhancement is above and beyond the adequacy standards, which includes educational space because it's based upon the allowable square footage of that building, based upon the number of students enrolled. So I think it's more of a case-by-case basis that gets evaluated at the commission level.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Matt, those cautions are really well placed. I share those sentiments. I just think, I think that the select committee may want to have some conversation about that, because I never want to be in a position where we're punishing a district for thinking outside the box or for prolonging, a building's usefulness, or, and that's a tough one. That comes back on our department. I know that, but I look forward to that visit. And I suspected as much that we're probably not looking at statutory change. That's something that we may want to ponder, though, and I'm looking over at the director. So thank you, Matt.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on Senator Landon, I guess I'd like to know what the process would be under the current circumstances if major maintenance funds or internal funds or wherever the source, but basically district funds are used to build out and renovate an existing facility that doesn't get component funding or direct funding from the legislature, but it's effectively educationally necessary. It might be deemed an enhancement at this point, but still fall within reasonable suitability or square footage or whatever else. Do we have a process whereby the district could come to the commission and say, all right, we just did this internally. We want this space to be certified as educationally necessary space, and therefore we want it to be included in our major maintenance calculation, which I think those of us that were on the little journey yesterday would agree that some of the spaces we saw were absolutely justifiable in terms of critical educational purpose. There was nothing fancy about them. It was just, we need to do these things. Do we have that process so that that approval could be made and it would all be taken care of? Or do we need to put in what would probably just be a little paragraph that says, you know, under these circumstances, the commission has the authority to provide exception approval? So I'm curious how that would work now and if we need to make any changes, Mr. Chairman.
Tanya?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Tanya Heitrich, Legislative Service Office. I would defer to the department on that question. They did just revise their rules and regulations fairly extensively. I think those went into effect in early 2022. That process includes a different designation or an alternative way to designate district-initiated enhancements versus state square footage. And so how those rules will be operationalized currently, I can't speak to. I know how it worked previously, but as I said, there were wholesale changes to those. So I would defer to the department on that.
Representative Landon, Co-Chair Landon?
I think I understand what the other two members of the committee are saying. I do see us going down a rabbit hole with this and getting kind of caught broadsided. Unfortunately, that if we start allowing these exceptions, to me, I actually just leaned over here to the former co-chair of this and I said, could we make this any more difficult than it already is? And that's exactly what I think we're looking at doing with these exceptions, is continuing to find a way to make this more onerous than it truly needs to be. You know, I certainly recognize in my district, we've got some areas that are not receiving the funding, and I'm sure that that's exactly what you guys are talking about. But what I think we need to look at on a more holistic level is a way to simplify this process, rather than finding exceptions to the rule and funding it at a granular level. I think a global view on this would be a much better approach for this committee to look at. To me, it seems like every time we come into a committee meeting with this situation, we're always trying to piecemeal instead of looking at a global scale and trying to understand what it is we actually need to fix. And what we need to fix is a much larger problem. We've got a lot of pieces that are not right, but I think going in and piecemealing just with a simple paragraph just creates that next exception for that next problem that we have in 5 years. So just my 2 cents.
Senator Rothfuss?
I guess the question there for the good representative would be, you know, what would be that simplification? Because I certainly don't disagree. We've had this conversation for a lot of years about challenges with the way we calculate. I think the incentives and the motivation that Mr. Wilmarth put forward about trying to right-size the districts through major maintenance pressure, which was effectively what was being done, right? Squeeze major maintenance funding until everybody has the right size. I understand that intent, but at the end of the day, I think we also understand that the number of students that are in a building is probably not strongly correlated with the number of dollars that the building takes for major maintenance, realistically. Although the motivation was to downsize it and make those two things sort of weirdly correlated. So yeah, I think a lot can be done if we just recognize how many square feet of educational space is the school that is, you know, maybe functional education, not enhancement, and then do the calculation based on that. We've talked about that before, but is that what you're contemplating, Representative Brown, or something else? How do we simplify this, which would probably be a good idea if we could pull it off and not have any unintended consequences?
Chairman Brown.
Well, I don't know. I don't know that I have all the answers, but what I'm more concerned about is the piecemealing. And I mean, I'm the first person to sit there and say that incrementalism is the best way to do policy decisions too. So I'm kind of contradicting myself here by saying that, but what we've got going on here is you're exactly right. We've got major issues with the way we calculate stuff, and it puts districts at a disadvantage in many cases, to where they are, they'll hold on to their major maintenance funding and worry about doing what they've got to do on their other, with their other projects that are not going to be funded by us. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure that I've got the answers, but I think with the collective wisdom, not only of this committee, but the other 89 members, plus myself, we can come up with something. And I don't think it's going to be anything that we do overnight. But I'm just urging caution on creating a piecemealed solution to fix this one little issue that we have going on right now.
Senator Rothfuss.
Well, I guess my recommendation, based on not having an alternative solution, would be to solve the problem that we see, which would be an incremental solution of a new paragraph or whatever it takes, while pursuing a wholesale scrap the system and fix it. I don't think we can just say, all right, we're not going to solve any problems because we don't like the system. We have to work within it until we can come up with something better. So I'd like to hear if we're okay, whether we need a change to this, because again, with the situation we saw yesterday, and I'm sure it happens throughout the state, I really appreciate the fact that Natrona County School District spent their own internal funds to provide suitable education to their students, and they did the right thing. And I'm never excited about punishing folks that do the right thing to improve education, and so if we don't have an approach to ensure that they're appropriately compensated for that additional space through major maintenance, I think we probably should, and that I don't think is mutually exclusive with the good co-chairman's suggestion of finding a better system overall.
Good. Matt, please.
Mr. Chairman, in Senator office, there may be a partial solution for either newer construction or major renovations of buildings. Let me give you, let me address Natrona first. I think the case-by-case basis through the rules could be one avenue. But I don't know that it would impact the overall major maintenance allocation to Natrona County, because I believe their actual square footage would still exceed their allowable 115% of the allowable square footage. So even if the addition to Park Elementary were to be identified as educational square footage, I still think they're going to receive the lesser of the allowable square footage in that calculation rather than their total actual. But let me give you an example where I think perhaps this formula doesn't necessarily protect the state's total interest. And this would be Shoshone, where the new K-12 building was built, I believe, about 4 or 5 years ago, and it anticipated a student count much higher than that actually exists today. So the building was built with anticipation of many more students, but this major maintenance formula allocates funding based upon the prior year's school ADM, and the allowable square footage of 115%, I believe, is lower than what the actual square footage the state invested into that building. And so perhaps the option here from a legislative policy perspective is any building that was newly constructed with state funds gets 100% of their square footage. Buildings that were built under the district's purview prior to the state's charge to construct buildings is under the the calculation utilizes the, lesser of the 115% allowable or the actual. But that has to be done on a school by school basis. Currently, the formula aggregates everything at the district level, so you lose that ability to make that decision point. You would have to make that decision on a facility basis, not on a district basis. So there would have to be some direction in statute to say this calculation has to be done on a facility basis. But if the state's interested in preserving its asset that it invested hundreds of millions of dollars in over the course of, the past 20 years, then maybe that's the avenue you go. Because I think Shoshone is an example where you've limited the amount of major maintenance going there based upon the number of actual students, not on what the facility was built to. So maybe that's.
And that's a good point, and I think it's a good way to draw the delineation to have both of the intents available, and I'm not certain it still gets to the good co-chairman's interest, but Shoshone is a great case study because the idea that we would erode the value of our investment because we miscalculated in the beginning the number of people that would be there, that's just shooting ourselves in the foot and then shooting ourselves in the other foot as a solution. That's not going to work well. So yeah, we have to preserve unless we want to come in with some other and do an assessment and an evaluation of whether that is the most cost-effective remedy. But while we have that in our fleet, we need to preserve the fleet, and we know that we should be fully funding major maintenance on that building. And it's a good point. Any new building that we've built under this system, we should be presuming was at least at the time built to our appropriate standards, and then you can subtract out enhancements and fully fund it. We don't need to be squeezing what exists right now. Good point.
Senator Landon.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Not to belabor, but to pick up on where the senator left off, that also comes into play with the buildings that you alluded to, Matt, does it not? We've got several schools out across the state. Jackson comes to mind, Sheridan comes to mind, several others that Riverton, they were built, before we took over. We inherited those facilities, and that should come into play as well. We don't want any way for those facilities to deteriorate since they're part of our fleet. But that's also, that goes back to 3-4 years ago when the former chairman and I visited with a couple of superintendents who walked us around their school districts and began to talk about this whole issue of suitability. And we flirted with that this morning, talking about, we've got lots of space out there in some circumstances, but it's not proper space. So how do we address that too? That's not a district trying to game any system. It's just them coming to us to say, how can we use this facility better? If you can just help us by moving a wall. Literally, the school that we toured yesterday began with the conversation of the principal going to her school district and saying, can we just move that wall so that I can see who's coming in the building? And the more they looked, the more they realized that it needed to be more than that. But anyway, I just wanted to throw out, that's where this whole suitability idea came into play. And I don't think the select committee has its arms around that very well to this point. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. I don't see any further hands.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, just to kind of close the loop on this section of educational square footage, I did run the numbers this morning. If the legislature were to fund all of the educational square footage, less enhancements, and less lease space, that's the additional, what I say, of 4.6 million square feet. It would generate an additional $18.4 million. So I just wanted to quantify, not in terms of just the square footage, but dollars of what that would cost. And that's an annual amount. Mr. Chairman.
Frankly, that's probably logical, because I think this committee agrees that, well, I think we've discussed in the past that the 2% is actually too low anyhow, right? It is. So
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, that's under the 2% multiplier. In terms of, what does $18 million mean annual? It's a 20% increase in total major maintenance funding for this statewide formula. That's not even addressing the multiplier.
20%, yeah. Please.
I think one thing that might be worth us understanding better, and maybe, I don't think we have the data today, but maybe for next time, we've seen it before, is kind of that breakdown of which, who's at the 115 versus actual. And I think what that doesn't necessarily show us, because it's aggregated at the district level, is more of the where and why do we have the problems? Are there some anomalous outliers that absorb a tremendous amount of that and would be difficult to justify paying the full major maintenance on at this point? Whereas many of the schools, we're not going to scrap them. We're basically going with what's effectively the most cost-effective remedy now, which is to maintain these buildings for a certain number of additional years as they are. And in the absence of the ability to scrap or mothball or downsize, we have to invest. So at that point, understanding which ones should we be investing in and which ones shouldn't we be investing in, which is effectively what we do, we should be making that decision to appropriately pay the major maintenance for those that we believe we should be investing in. So when we talk about the 20% increase, I mean, maybe that ends up being the right number, but maybe it really is only a 15% increase when you actually take a look around at what the fleet looks like and where we should be putting increased major maintenance funds. I don't know if we have that level of analysis. I don't.
I think Matt's information here says there's only 5 districts that are doing total, correct?
Mr. Chairman, and Representative or Senator Office, that last paragraph on page 2 identified only 5 school districts that are using their actual square footage. The remaining 43 in the state are using their 115% of the allowable. So if you look at the, the $18.9 million is the allowable. If you go back up to table 1, that educational is 18.56 million. So that differential of, about 300,000 is those 5 districts, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, once we calculate the allowable, that's $18.6 million gross square feet, we multiply it by the cost replacement value. And the cost replacement value is identified as an amount utilizing either an elementary school, a middle or junior high school, or a high school, using the RS means, which is a construction cost index. And then the Wyoming Department of Administration information uses Wyoming values for that. And so for last school year, 21-22, $182.87 or $182.87 was that replacement value. And that was multiplied by that square feet. And then the multiplier of 2% comes in, and that's where it generates the $68 million. And that's in figure 3.
Boy, that number seems low to me. I wish we could get schools for $182 a square foot.
Mr. Chairman, in terms of where will this amount go for school year 22-23, it'll be $192. And then an estimated amount for 23-24 will be about $214.
Is that including site costs, just building costs?
Mr. Chairman, it is just the building cost. It does not include site costs.
Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, I believe that comes from the work of the commission and department with their consultant a couple of years ago. So, Mr. Chairman, related to office and warehouse building, the square footage, again, lease subtracts any lease or enhanced square feet, but it's a little bit differently done on the allowable square footage. In the same statute, 21-15-109, subsection C, paragraph 7, there's subparagraphs B through E that dictate how much of that office and warehouse space is used in the calculation. So subparagraph B at the bottom of page 3 provides for if the proportion of the office and warehouse square feet is 10% or less as compared to the educational square feet, they're entitled to 100% of that office and warehouse space.
Does a warehouse space encompass all grounds, maintenance buildings, and transportation buildings?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's correct. The office is really the administration buildings. Any other facility, warehouse space, are the buildings related to bus barns or other non-administrative office space. If, Mr. Chairman, if the proportion is greater than 10% but less than 16%, the districts are entitled to 90%. And if the proportion is 16% or greater but less than 21%, they're entitled to 80% of that square footage. And then if the proportion is 21% or greater as compared to their educational square feet, they get 70%. So in terms of what the breakdown is, 19 school districts receive 100% of their office and warehouse space. 19 school districts receive 90% of that square footage. 8 districts receive 80%, and 2 districts receive 70%. Mr. Chairman, I do have a correction on figure 4 in the preceding paragraphs. The cost replacement values I identified in figure 4 for these spaces were actually the national values. They weren't the Wyoming values. So the $184.96 is actually $166.46. That's for the office space. And then the warehouse space is $144.31, not the $160.34. So I apologize on that mistake in the issue brief. Looking forward, next school year, the warehouse space, and I'll go slow here if some of you are writing, for fiscal year 23, the office space will be $168.48. For fiscal year 24, this is an estimate, it'll be $194.23. So a pretty big jump there. For warehouse space, for fiscal year 23, the 144 will increase to $147. And then for fiscal year 24, $182.83. So you can see the inflation on the construction costs have influenced those amounts significantly. So in total, as I indicated, the office and warehouse building maintenance calculations, again, that has the same multiplier of 2%. And the total amount appropriated or allocated under the formula is $6.8 million.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we toured facilities yesterday, some of those schools had what I would call portable sheds for storing necessary educational materials and whatnot. Would those be considered as part of the square footage of warehouse space, or would those just really be ignored and any maintenance covered by the district? And
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, it depends on what the purpose of that storage shed or the modular building is. If it is for educational, if it's serving students or serving education, it's an educational square footage. If it's storing lawn equipment or groundskeeping equipment or stuff like that, it's considered a warehouse space.
Yeah, I think it was PE equipment that they were storing in the one we saw, so that would be educational.
Mr. Chairman, the final kind of square footage piece are mothballed facilities. For any building that is mothballed, it's essentially the same square footage or the calculation as the educational square footage, but it only allocates 10% of the total amount that it would have allocated. So that's just it's based upon an exterior closure factor of 10% based upon commission direction. So, Mr. Chairman, that essentially is the formula, and the remaining parts of the issue brief get into kind of the other subject areas that this priority topic is supposed to address. So before I move on, I wanted to make sure if there are any other questions on the calculation itself, I can address
Questions,
those.
committee? No? Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, before you go on the mothball, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
On the mothballed, they're only allowed to be mothballed for 3 years, and then they have to ask for an exception to go beyond that, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, that is my understanding. That is correct. Again, I would defer to the department if that is a misunderstanding.
Yep, sounds like it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, the next piece of this major maintenance discussion is we've talked about enhancements a little bit, but districts under Wyoming Statute 2115-109 subsection F are allowed to utilize up to 10% of its allocation for major maintenance to repair or replace items that are not within its facility plan or maintain a local enhancement. But this expenditure can only occur based upon the State Construction Department's approval, in that they have addressed all of their needs in their facility plan. So I'll take any questions. That statute's been on the books for some time. But some districts are allowed to divert, up to 10% to either maintain an enhancement or any other items that are not addressed in their facility plan.
No questions? Questions?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the next figure 6 on page 5, just gives you an illustration of the historical major maintenance payments. I will point out, you'll notice some years, for example, fiscal year 2009 or school year 2008-9 was higher than the following school year 2009-10. This was not a function of the formula saying, hey, there's a lot less students or a lot less square footage. What previously occurred in many years was the July 1st date didn't really, and the total appropriation didn't allow for a proper timing of appropriation. So part of the change in 2018 and 2019 allowed for any difference in or any shortfall or discrepancy or overpayment, underpayment in major maintenance payments to be made up the following year. And changing some of the timing of when the payments go out allowed for a more precise allocation of appropriations from the legislature. So as I identified, it's already anticipated that $9 million will be needed for the fiscal year 24 payment. And this, prior to those statutory changes, never allowed for the legislature to, one, know of a potential shortfall, but two, there was never a mechanism in the statutes that allowed for an underpayment or an overpayment to be corrected the following year. So you will no longer see kind of these large differences in appropriations on a historical basis. Over the course of from school year or fiscal year 1998-99 to 21-22, $1.1 billion has been allocated to school districts. As I indicated earlier, about $159 million has already been appropriated for this upcoming biennium. Mr. Chairman, the final piece related to major maintenance is, as I think we've indicated, this is not a new topic to this committee. Since 2016, this committee has studied major maintenance about 3 times. They've received reports from Facility Engineering Associates, which is a contractor for the State Construction Department. There have been bills proposed to the legislature to increase the multiplier from 2% to 2.5%. Those have not been enacted into law. I ran the numbers again for that this morning. If even for next school year, you wanted to increase the multiplier from 2 to 2.5%, that would be it's a 25% increase. That's about $22 million per year. Per year. And the 2.5%, the recommendation from the state construction's consultant was 2.15% would go to facilities, and then 0.35% of that multiplier would be identified for site and code compliance needs. So that's the history of that, that multiplier.
Questions? Cost?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, out of curiosity, the 10% allocated for enhancements to be able to use, if that were changed, how much of that would reduce the money being used for enhancements, but only used for their major maintenance? Would that, do you know what that shift would be, where it would be used for their major maintenance? My struggle is I have no problems with enhancements at all, but I think it needs to be the responsibility of the district to cover the maintenance of those. I know that gets into a little bit of a difficulty determining something, but the 10%, if we're struggling to try to maintain the buildings, what would the difference be there?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cost, I don't know that I have an answer to that. I deferred back to the department when they come up to discuss, to address that for you. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, as part of the memo, I wanted to identify, sometimes major maintenance money will not take care of all of a district's needs, or they will never accumulate enough funds over a short period of time to replace an HVAC system or a roof or some other component within their facilities. So the legislature and the department and the commission have for some time appropriated and identified necessary component project funding. Prior to its name of component project funding, the legislature identified this as minor capital construction. And so the state construction department has set up a process for districts to work with its staff to identify these component project needs across the state. They have a formal committee that evaluates certain criteria, and they then forward these onto the commission, and the commission submits these to the legislature for purposes of financing. So in Figure 7, I've identified the historical appropriations, either from minor capital construction or what now is termed component funding. In the most recent budget session, the legislature appropriated $21 million to address component level needs. So this is in addition to any major maintenance funding that districts have been able to access. So over the course of these appropriations, an additional $156.6 million has been appropriated in addition to that $1.1 billion of major maintenance. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, the priority, interim topic priority, wanted to identify what are the routine maintenance funding amounts allocated to school districts to assist in kind of the daily or weekly or monthly duties of maintaining facilities. I think yesterday we identified those deep cleaning activities that occur during the summer from the custodians in the district. So for this most recent school year, the K-12 funding model, or the Education Resource Block Grant model, appropriated $140.3 million for routine maintenance. And on page 7 of the issue brief, it identifies those categories. So those 5 categories include the custodial staff, the maintenance workers, the groundskeepers, the supplies and materials related to those activities, and then utility or energy costs. The block grant doesn't necessarily, and the legislature has never required districts to hire these staff. They can be contracted or a combination of those. And I think districts contract for, specialty areas of HVAC or electrical needs across their state. So the formulas and allocation methodology originated from the legislature's 2005 school finance recalibration effort. And Table 3 identifies that kind of the duties of those personnel related to custodians, maintenance workers, and groundskeepers. I won't go through each of those. I'll leave that to the committee to read. But in addition to the approximately $80 to $90 million in major maintenance funding per year, depending on what year we're talking about, there's an additional $140 million just to keep up with the daily or weekly activities to maintain the facilities. With that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Excellent report and memo. Committee, any questions for Mr. Wilmarth on this portion? Okay, well, I agree. Well done. Thank you very much. We do have a second portion to this topic. However, we're at the hour of a break, so I think I'm going to go ahead and let's take our break now. What time is it? It's 10:15. Yeah, let's be back at 10:30 and we'll continue with the department. Thank you. I better turn my mic on. Okay, we'll come back to order. Okay, we left off in the middle of the maintenance funding for K-12 facilities. So right now, we have the department up to discuss the review of prior K-12 maintenance and their report. So, Director, please.
Thank you. Good morning to the committee, and thank you, Chairman Pappas. Jerry Vincent, Director of the State Construction Department. I have with me today, starting aside, Laura Anderson, who is the Finance and Operations Administrator for our department. Valerie Hughes, who is our School Facilities Division Administrator, and John Rexis, who is our Construction Management Supervisor. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Valerie. We'll start talking about some of the, thank you, some of the major maintenance things we'd like to touch on. We think LSO and Matt did a wonderful job covering a lot of that, but we do have some other comments and things to add. And of course, we're available to take any questions. And if we don't know what the answer is, we'll figure it out and we'll get back to you. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Valerie, please.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hughes?
Thank you, Chairman Pappas, committee members. So just to circle back, as Jerry mentioned, LSO did a very nice comprehensive review of major maintenance. I just wanted to circle back on a couple items that were some of the questions that came up. In terms of enhancements, there is a process for that. It is encapsulated within the rules. Those can go before the commission for review. And then in addition to that, the commission is charged with review of the adequacy standards every 4 years. So if there's multiple enhancements that came in for a particular item, and I'll use turf fields, for example, right? If that was something that we saw come in repeatedly and it was something that we thought was appropriate for the commission to consider bringing into the adequacy standards so that it is something that gets funded, or major maintenance could be used upon it, that process is outlined within the rules, just to kind of add that in for everyone. And then separately, to circle back, there are 3 districts paid off of gross square footage, and there are 45 that are paid on allowable. I know that was another question everyone had. And then separately, for fiscal year 20 and 21, on average for all districts, roughly about 5 to 6% of total expenditures per fiscal year were made on enhancements. I know John's got another item to circle back on, and then we can, whatever questions in addition to that or what else you'd like us to highlight, I can certainly do that as well.
Question from Co-Chairman Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, and this was something that I was thinking of asking Matt, and I probably should have just asked him directly, but one of the questions that I had was about the 10% that they can use to cover their enhancements. And it said it's at the, basically at the pleasure or the allowance of you guys. What dictates that with your guys' approval? Is that the listing of what you guys provide, that this is the funding that you give to them for these projects and that those projects must be met? And then if they have leftover, they can then use that 10%? Or how is that met, I guess?
Chairman Pappas, Representative Brown, we do track regularly within our system to, based upon the major maintenance allocations that are made to districts. Essentially, our system is tracking how much of that, so that 10% allowable that could be used towards the enhancements. In terms of how that actually functions, when a district puts that in, we would actually have to have record of the enhancement existing. So department would have to actually indicate to us, inform us that that enhancement was made on a property, whatever the case was. Then at that point, if they wanted to use major maintenance dollars towards it, they would submit a work order within our system. And essentially we would cross-reference that, right? Does that fall within what that 10% allowable really is? So it's kind of full picture in that. And does that help answer that question?
I think so, and I'll catch up with you offline.
Okay.
Okay. Continue.
Thank you, Chairman Pappas and
committee members. I just wanted to point out that of the current 24 million square foot of educational space, roughly 2.36% of that is enhanced square footage, and that equates to 565,000 square feet. Of that, I think we see a combination of larger spaces where districts have enhanced new construction and added square footage for different purposes, whether it's core areas or gymnasiums or auditoriums. In some cases, we see pre-K classrooms added on that are considered enhancements. Some instances of enlarged CTE spaces that are considered enhancements. And then also, I think included in some instances are probably buildings that were scheduled to be demolished originally upon appropriation and a project being allocated to them for a new building, where those buildings haven't gone away. And so we've considered some of those to be enhancements if the district chooses to not demolish those and keep them. So any questions?
Questions, committee? Senator Rothfuss.
I guess I'll just ask if there has been anything similar to what we saw at Pine View, where there's clearly an internal adjustment in square footage that is essential for the core educational purposes, and whether there has been consideration, action taken on something like that to include it in allowable square footage as opposed to an enhancement. And Ms. Hytrek was just showing me in the new rules where you could basically have an appeal process along those lines, and so it does look like there's a process. Have we seen that yet?
Chairman Pappas, Senator Rothfuss, thanks for the question. I'm not aware specifically of any at this point. I know that they're out there, but I couldn't tell you exactly where or what the sizes are. But I know that there's been additions in educational spaces that have been added by districts, similar to the instance that we saw yesterday. One thing I think that I would like to point out is that we approach the allowable square footages and the enrollments on a district-wide basis, and that this particular district is a school of choice district. You know, so there may be seats at another school that are available, but there are students that want to go to this school, and the district chooses to allow them there, and that's, I think, why there was the consideration to call this enhanced educational footage.
Senator Rothfuss.
In this particular instance, I don't know, I think they just took the budget on themselves, and I don't know that they've worked through the process of appeal. I mean, realistically, I don't think anyone would ever conclude that it was an enhancement when you have to go through a gym to get to a stage to interact with students, and there's no way to either get there without going outside the building or through the gym. Creating the hallway all of a sudden makes it's hard to argue that that was an enhancement, and we just upsized the school or anything like that. But it sounds like that's kind of a new process, effectively, for that appeal to be allowed. So this is one that we might want to take through the process, even though, as we heard from Mr. Wilmarth, since they're over the 115%, it wouldn't affect the final calculation, but it still might be appropriate to have it recorded through that process to reflect what its purpose is. Is that kind of fair, that maybe that's an approach we should take as we're looking at this system?
Senator Pappas, Chairman Pappas and Senator Rothfuss, I think that's a fair statement. I don't mean to allude that that it isn't a good idea from a educational programming standpoint for them to have done what they've done. I'm just kind of stating how we calculate and identify what those enhancements are.
Chairman Pappas, Senator Rothfuss, I'll go ahead and add that enhancement is actually a statutory definition. It is district initiated plus if it exceeds the adequacy standards. There isn't consideration for the reasonableness of an addition. So it would take an amendment to statute.
Co-Chairman Brown.
To that point, I think, you know, when I sit there and I think about the situation where we built on a hallway, I take 2 steps back and go, why wasn't this done originally? Why did we miss the boat? And so then I started thinking about the situation in my school district where we've had stuff value engineered down, and maybe that was a circumstance in which something like this, there was a hallway originally that got VE down. But that's one of those things that I think we have to take back instead of looking at directly and saying, this is an enhancement that we added on. It's whether or not it was originally there and it got removed or something along those lines, because it could have been in that situation.
Chairman Brown, the issue is this school was built way before
Okay.
there was even thought of having the state taking care of facilities, and so that that corridor was never there, and you always had to go through the gym to get to that space, and it's just functionally not. It's something that should have been repaired a long time ago, but it was before our time.
Well, and I think, Mr. Chairman, to that extent, I agree. I think it's an important notice that the functionality is probably something that we should be looking at as far as what the statute says, because if it's clearly causing chaos or disruption in any way, shape, or form, we should be looking at that at this committee's level and at the legislative level on whether or not we want to take care of those students. So.
Senator Rothfuss.
Follow up on that, and this is a discussion we obviously had last year, and we talked about legislation last year with regard to the allowable use of major maintenance funding to improve suitability of classrooms. For example, the case we always use where, you know, there's a large room like this that if we put a wall down the middle of it, now is 2 classrooms and they're functional. So your educational suitability just dramatically increased. And we know that you can't use major maintenance for that. So we contemplated changes to statute to allow that. It seems like this is another place in our major maintenance discussion where we need to incorporate delineating between what is an enhancement and what is appropriate use of the space, to just delineate and clarify that. And it sounds like the suitability concept is what we need to add here as well. Just the idea that it can be justified to not be an enhancement if it improves the suitability of instruction or something along those lines. I mean, is that what we're looking for in that little paragraph, is the suitability like we were talking about last year, where improvements to educational suitability can be, I don't know what we'd call them, standard expenditures as opposed to enhancement expenditures?
Someone want to answer that?
Senator Rothfuss. Valerie may have something to add, but I think part of the issue with that is we currently don't have a definition for what suitability is and what is considered suitable and what isn't. I mean, I tend to think our role is primarily construction and the maintenance of the assets that the state has, and so we'd have to probably get some kind of feedback from somebody in regards to delivering the basket of goods and what the educational programming is that depicts suitability.
And again, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I think that was the other part of the bill, and that was probably the part of the bill that got the bill killed.
You're right.
Was concerns about adding suitability explicitly as discussed, and I don't think anybody had any concerns about the aspect of the legislation that allowed major maintenance funds to be used to improve that suitability. It just was the definition of suitability. And honestly, maybe that comes down to the wisdom and judgment of the commission. Is an expenditure deemed appropriate for an improvement to suitability? Yes or no? I don't know.
Well, you know, it's unfortunate, in my opinion, that we don't have suitability and why we removed it. And I don't want to speak for the commission, but I think the commission agrees that suitability needs to be in there. And it's just something that we couldn't put our minds around and grasp. So what did we do? We took it out, right? Yeah. So maybe we need to revisit that. So, okay.
Chairman Pappas and Senator Rothfuss, I think you've hit the conversation on the head where we're coming from. You know, later on there's a department vision, and really what I'd like to do is discuss some of the catch-22s that I've seen, you know, in this past year, and see how you guys have been addressing this far longer than the year that I've been here. But when you talk about, I brought this up last fall when we were updating how the rules were stepping through with the commission when we updated you. And I can tell you the districts were very verbal about the phrase district initiated. If they didn't believe we produced a way for them to do it, then somebody had to do it, whether it's that external walkway or not. And because I did it and I initiated it, then now I have to pay for it, and that doesn't qualify for major maintenance. So they felt like they were in a catch-22. I know maybe January, we went to Plat 1 to visit the superintendent and look at some of their issues. They have a high school campus that has standalone buildings with a wide open quad, and we were there in about a 20-degree day, and we were watching all the kids with their t-shirts on and whatever you have when you're in a classroom cut across a quad, and he's going, is there any way some walkway comes in that ties it all together? Well, it's not major maintenance because it wasn't existing. It's not a maybe CapCon project. Is it a component? And then how does it move its way up? So just some of those kind of catch-22. So, and is it suitable to have someone not walk through the outside in 20-degree temperature? I would think so. So I think you're touching on something that we run into with questions and emails on a regular basis. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay. Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This sounds a little crazy, but maybe if we can come up with a better term than suitability that people would understand more or be able to comprehend in a different way. Suitability maybe attracts them to a side, well, it is suitable for what or whom, whereas if we say, is there another word that would better reflect what we're trying to do, maybe that would help a bill of such to move better. Just a suggestion.
A lot of times we actually are looking at functionality, you know, what makes the school function as it should. And there's another word for you if you want. Okay, any further questions on that point? Okay, any further information you want to share with us on major maintenance here?
Just one more thing, and I think Valerie knows the details of this better than I, but I'll tee it up. We were talking about how much money is in, of the 10% is enhancement. If a district goes forward with their own money, depreciation reserves or whatever, and does an enhancement, they're not under an obligation to report that to us unless they want it to go on record so they can then qualify for major maintenance. So when we give you our picture of what we know, that's not the whole picture. I don't know if you can define that or refine that any better for me than that.
Misuse? Yeah, it's a tough button.
Yeah.
Got to push hard.
Chairman Pappas, I would just add that I don't want to say that it's necessarily a requirement, but they are supposed to let us know of enhancements or inform us of that, right? So that we can track that as well.
So I'm assuming that those will be brought to light once we have a new facilities survey coming up. We'll be having a consultant visiting every facility, correct? And we'll be able to know, even if they don't, even if they haven't told us of an enhancement, we'll be capturing that data. Am I correct in that?
Chairman Pappas, the assessment will cover all educational spaces in addition to some non-educational spaces as well. And say, use parking as the example from yesterday. On the visual inspection, that would obviously show that there's some additional spaces there. So something like that would be, I would presume would be very visible and come to the surface through this assessment. If it's something that is, that's not part of that review, I guess, if it's an enhancement in a different way, then that would not be highlighted by this.
I would only see that happen if it was an enhancement that was a separate facility somewhere else, not attached to an existing facility. Probably, there's probably no instance of that, but maybe, I don't know. But certainly, the consultant will be looking at, will they ignore any enhancement, or will they actually assess the enhancement as well? Can you tell me that?
Chairman Pappas, if the enhancement included a system or a component in which they were actually taking a look at for this assessment, if it was within that space, but if there's essentially not one of those within that building space, then it may not be picked up, if you will. I don't know.
My concern is that maybe, we have 500,000 square feet that are considered enhanced square footage. Most of it's probably connected integrally into the facility. For instance, there could be a gym. It's going to be attached to the other gym, I'm assuming, or something like that, or like in the Laramie High School, there's a swimming pool, there's a larger auditorium space. But if I think that even though we're not, the state is not providing any funds for those other than maybe the 10%. I think that if our consultants are out there surveying the facility and providing an assessment of it, it can't be that much more expensive for them to include that enhancement. I'm hoping that, I don't know what you've got in your contract with your consultant, but someday those things may become, part of our allowable and not, for instance, you mentioned tracks. Right now they're enhancements, but as far as synthetic tracks, and frankly, I see everybody putting in synthetic tracks because it just makes economic sense in this climate, and so I fully see those things becoming allowable. So if we're not assessing those now, then we've lost all that data. We need to capture that data. So I'm hoping that we will assess when we're out there in the field, assess this enhanced square footage. I don't know, maybe I should let the committee, that's my thoughts. What do you guys think? You folks think? All right, first of all, let me ask you, is it in the contract? Are they doing that? Are they going to do that, or they're not going to do that?
Mr. Chairman, are you asking me, are they assessing tracks as part of this?
Are they assessing any enhancements when they're going to go out and do the new assessment that we'll see in January, right?
Mr. Chairman, we could add that into the scope, but currently what we depict is that we want the facilities assessed. We haven't had those discussions yet about particularly identifying the enhancements and having them separated out as part of that assessment.
Mr. Chairman, it's a good time to ask that question. So in case the committee doesn't know, we've closed the RFP. We've shortlisted some firms, and next week we interview. And then when we select, while we're getting ready to contract, we pull them in, we go over scope of work. I'm hearing, and it kind of was making sense to me, that we educate them about what we do and what enhancement might look like so eyes can be put on them. Some might be more obvious to find than others. We allow one scoreboard, so districts put the second one on their own, how to look for that. And of course, you look out and you see a big, beautiful field and track out there, right? So that's part of our scope that John's saying, that we will teach them to look for. And to the extent that we can, we want to have our project manager accommodate them out in the field, and then there'll be a district person out there as well. So that can be incorporated in their scope of work. Just wanted to let you know we're at the interview stage right now.
Okay, well, committee, I'd like your thoughts on my thinking here. Do we ask the consultant to assess our enhanced properties, the district's enhanced properties, or do we not? Senator Office.
But I think we'd want them to assess anything that's part of the educational facility overall. And I think it would be honestly more difficult probably for them not to do it that way. Then after that, we would probably be the ones that would back out how enhancements played a role in it. So it's possible we could try and identify some simple enhancements, like is there a track? Should there be a track? That's pretty binary. But our high school, for example, we increased square footage in commons areas with enhancement. I mean, there's no way you're going to separate out, all right, well, we're not going to look over at that corner of the room. So I think it would be really impossible for them not to end up assessing enhancements. So I've always thought when we've done these that we should be as open and inclusive and always err on the side of assessing more than assessing less. For example, the UW Lab School is on university property. I assume that that's once again going to be included in the assessment. And we have other facilities along those lines, which you could make an argument, well, maybe we shouldn't include it. I think every time there's a possibility of include yes or no, we should always go with the yes side of it and get the information, because it's a lot more expensive to send out after the fact, bring the team back, hey, we need you again, we changed our mind, than to just have a comprehensive approach.
So in your Laramie High School, do we assess the pool, for instance? And that's clearly a separate item.
Yeah, that's, I would say, yes, they should assess it, but yes, it is 100% enhancement. I think that, again, while they're in the building, the additional assessment to maybe provide some feedback on, hey, maybe this is beginning to suffer some dilapidation, which it better not be at this point. They could measure the pool and tell us that it's about an inch short in one direction.
Okay, we do have Ms. Heitrick, do you have
Yes,
some
Mr. Chairman, just a
comment?
couple of points. And the first is that the state construction department is required to track enhancements. I think it's done through their 5-year planning process. It's also in their rules and regulations. And through that process, every 4 years, the commission would review those and make a determination in the context of the adequacy standards about whether those would be included, enhancements that were utilized in a positive manner to deliver education, if those should be included in the adequacy standards. And to Senator Rothfuss's point, there's also a provision that in the new, I think it's Chapter 11, Section D, that allows districts to challenge any designation of enhancement that has a positive demonstrable effect on the delivery of education.
Okay, thank you. Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So Tanya, just maybe for you or for the director, is there anything in the RFP that's already been sent out and we're already well within the process of of determining this consultant to come in? Is there anything that prohibits us from being more inclusive, as the senator pointed out, versus less inclusive? I tend to feel the same way as Senator Roth was. We're a couple of years late coming out with this assessment anyway. I think we better take full advantage if we can, but any restrictions, anything that we need to be concerned about?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, I'm not familiar with the RFP or its provisions, so State Construction Department is the best person to answer that.
Perhaps the department could, what I heard, I don't think that they haven't talked fee yet, and they haven't interviewed the folks yet, so I imagine they can amend any RFP they wanted at this point. Director, could you, or
Mr. Chairman.
well, the RFP, that's right, the RFP, but what I'm saying, what the scope of the RFP could probably be amended with their finalists.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I can speak to that a little bit.
Okay, John,
So
please.
we put an awful lot of thought into the deliverables that we're expecting out of this process. And we are in the middle of procurement. So I was going to touch on this a little later as an update to the assessment and where we're at schedule-wise on that and what our anticipated deliverable dates were going to be. But we have a vision. We haven't necessarily put that out there because this is a qualification-based selection.
Mm-hmm.
And so the things that we're looking for from the firms that we're going to be interviewing are their approach and their strategy for providing us with the deliverables that we're looking for. And I didn't want to necessarily tell them what my vision was or how I would take care of this task, because I don't want to steer that. I want to get feedback from all of them, determine who has the best approach and who has the best vision for the project. And then once they're selected, start having conversations about that so that we've got a good deliverable that's usable information and is comprehensive and going to suit everything that we need it to.
Mr. Chairman.
Co-Chairman Brown.
I'm from what I'm understanding, it sounds like at the point of the RFP, you guys left it broad-based, so we're not going to go narrowly scoping in on that. When we get down and you guys select the vendor, this is something you guys can absolutely add into the scope of work once you've determined that their qualifications meet what we're looking for and what you're looking for. Is that an easy, quick way of summarizing what you just said?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, that's exactly correct. And since these guys are the experts, we want to hear what they have to say and what they bring to the table. We don't necessarily want them tailoring their strategy to fit what they think they are hearing us say. Yeah. So we do want to have those types of conversations, and I think we're welcome to have some additional participation at that point in time, and some input and feedback from any members that would like to give us that. But right now, I don't want to get too deep into how we think they should go about this, simply because I don't taint the process.
Mr. Chairman, so I would think, based off of the committee's discussion here, it seems, I mean, we're not going to see you before you select your vendor now. So based off of what you're hearing now, I mean, we could probably take a vote and say, hey, let's put a piece of paper down in front of you guys to tell you guys we want this included. But it seems to me like you guys probably understand that we're looking for this to be included once it goes through for the actual selection criteria.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, that's correct. And I think I'd just like to reiterate something that I said earlier. I mean, our intent is to have them assess the full building for every educational building that we're sending them out for, regardless of what spaces within that building are labeled as enhancements or not.
Perfect. I think that's what we're trying to do. What we're trying, at least my goal at this topic. Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The other thing, I think, by including the enhancement, it could bring to light something that maybe we haven't considered in the past that we maybe should consider as part of the school educational process. So it opens our eyes to other things that maybe schools are trying to do, because it's a majority of schools trying to cover something that we have neglected to see as valuable. So maybe it opens our eyes to other things for the future of education as well.
Okay, well, I think you got a feel for what the committee thinks, and I do think we need to get as much data as we can, so thank you.
You're welcome. And then Chairman Pappas, just one more follow-up. I believe it was the Senator cost question when we're talking about suitability, just sort of a reminder and refresher for us that what was decided was that it is be based on 4 criteria. There was tech readiness, air quality, illumination. Those are probably pretty straightforward, and I'm guessing, we weren't all around that, and I'm guessing the difficult one was appropriateness of the student environment, and that's big, and I'm guessing there was a struggle as how to define that. So, but those were the 4 originally that were put forth.
Okay. All right, so does that conclude your comments on major maintenance?
Yes, sir.
Funding? Okay. Any questions of the department? Okay, here, seeing none, I will open this topic to public comment on funding of major maintenance. Is there any public comment? Anybody online? No? Public comment? Seeing none, we'll close public comment, and then we'll move on to our next topic. So that's the report from the State Construction Department on School Facility Division for statewide K-12 schools.
I can start things off, Mr. Chair and committee. So regarding the overall staffing, I'll start with that of the department. A year ago, when I first came on board, we've had 8 staff members leave in the last 12 months. And there was 3 vacancies when I came on board. We are at a place now where we have made offers, and I believe both have accepted the last 2 vacant positions in the department. So within about 3 weeks, we should be at full capacity on the positions that we've been budgeted for. 2 of those are key because they are in the school facilities division, where the 3rd planner is now being backfilled. And then the person who's been doing all of our K-12 contracts and interacting with the district and their software plans and programs. So we feel, I was asked a question the other day, do you need more people? And I said, I just can't answer that question because we've never had the correct amount of people yet. So let's just start with that before I say 5 more, 10 more. Let's just start with, let's get at full capacity. Let's get them trained up and let's see where we're at. So we're excited about that. And Valerie, I don't know if anything else to add to that. We're looking forward to it. One should be on board the 27th, and I think the other one shortly after the 4th of July. And then we will start our onboarding. We feel good about that process. We've had retirements. We've had at least one who's left for more money, working on the school district side. We've had a variety of things. We've had some other health issues in there. So I don't think it was the environment overall. I just think that we have 29 people in the entire department, and our school facilities division with these 2 new people, once they get on board and once they get trained, Valerie will have 9 people, counting herself, that support the 48 school district. So she's lean and mean over there on their side of the house.
Can you tell us where those folks are located? All in Cheyenne?
All in Cheyenne, yes.
Except for, there is one in Evanston, correct?
Oh, so I thought you were referring to the new ones that are coming aboard. I'm sorry, yes. When I say 9, one of the employees is co-shared. They work out of Evanston, and they support our construction management division side, and they support the school side. So it's 8 employees with 1 shared.
Okay, great.
Any questions?
Questions on staffing committee? Okay, continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of a vision, we talked earlier, I was pleased to hear the select committee on interim topics conversations about what you want to discuss this year and this biennium, because a lot of the things that we're seeing, we're hearing kind of overlap in there. Some came up during the tour yesterday. You're bringing them up today as well, and we share some of those same questions. We get calls from the districts. We meet with the districts. The use of major maintenance, I think it's been discussed here. It was discussed in our walk yesterday. And even today, you know, I brought up the walkway that ties the campus together. You see how they had to create their own corridor yesterday. What we have to work with in statute right now is that it is the repair or replace of something that is existing. And I think I heard some comments yesterday about perhaps that should be discussed, maybe opened up. We're just putting that out there as something that we run into on a regular basis. So we want to let you know what we're hearing from the school districts. We have tried not to get very technical on the repair and replace. We've had a few that used to have a heating system only. And then they're coming in with a new heating air conditioning system. And in the past, we'd say, oh, that's new. It was repair, replace of a heating system. And so we are trying to take the position that it was a climatized control system before, and it is now, right? So that's some of the approach that we're taking and how to address that, because it seems very singular in how it's called out in the statute. So that was one of the catch-22s. We've heard about the districts who district initiated. Why initiated? Because I don't think you had a process for that. So we've heard that brought up. There's been conversation, and we would ask that it continue. These items we would take through our commission as well and discuss, but we're talking with the select committee today about the component funding and what is it and how did it get there and should it continue and should it look the same? We've heard conversation from the select on that, and even the commission. We would welcome more conversation on that as well. We have some questions on how it's used and how it might be used. We have a lot of districts who you would have, I'll just say, the 2 million and under remedy of issues on the site, the major maintenance, and then maybe the 20 million and above. You were waiting for your SCI score to say you're a new school remedy. We have a lot of schools that just pick a range around that 5 to 15 million to asset preserve that school, especially with the cost of new schools these days. And I don't see a mechanism for that right now. I don't know if I've heard conversation that maybe a renovation program, might be something that covered that in the middle. And then you allow that, part of that 5 to 15 million is major maintenance items. So how does that dovetail together? I heard the term yesterday, if we can sort of have this confluence of these different things to bring money to the table to make it happen. I would say that, and Valerie could comment on it more, we have a lot of these schools who need a $5 to $15 million remedy. I think their bones are good. They might not necessarily need a new $30 or $50 million remedy, but it's more than maybe a $2 million major maintenance could solve. And so if we could have conversations continued about that, I would appreciate that as well.
So, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Director, I really appreciate all of those comments. Going back to the initial part of what you were saying, I would really value the new perspective that the table in front of us brings to this whole view of how we're doing business. And I would hope that for the second meeting, that comes up later in the year, you would bring to us anything you run across in the statutes, anything with respect to methodology with the commission that our panel might be able to help with. If we need some modifications or need to consider a different way of going about something, I would hope you'd bring that to us.
Mr. Chair, Senator Landon, thank you very much. I feel good about the team and the competency, the fresh look. We see things and we ask why, and a lot of times we've got information back and it's okay, that makes sense. And other ones are still out there. One of the other, visions, I guess that we will talk about with the commission in retreat, and then also for select, we have a retreat coming up at our next commission meeting, was brought up briefly yesterday during the tour. To help the districts out, I think there's times when we do design guidelines every 4 years, and we do rules every 4. If there's something And I've appreciated all the elected officials that I've met so far, because they'll say, hey, we think we know what we're doing, but if it turns out you're trying to roll it out and it's wrong, you don't have to wait for the 4-year window before it's all reviewed again, right? So we are going to, if we see something in a design guideline that we feel should be addressed, or in a rule, we will start it off with our commission and we will talk to them about it and bring one-offs together instead of nothing until you get everything. And we think that might be a better way to kind of ongoing, right? There are departments even in the state here, but I've run into that they have people who work on rulemaking. You don't do it and then go do something else for 4 years and then do it again. You're always sort of looking at it and trying to evolve it. I think it's less painful on us, but the only 9 people over on that side, and it's probably less painful on the school side where you don't look at anything until you look at 300 pages of stuff all at one time. And certainly for the commission and the select committee as well. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to pause just for a moment to recognize Representative Pat Sweeney, who joined us. Representative Sweeney, thanks for being with us today. Okay, back to business here. So let's turn to the supplemental budget, including statewide building condition assessment and prioritization of projects. Can we delve into that a little deeper here? And we'll talk about the single request for design and construction as well coming up here. It's one of our priorities for this interim to look at. So tell us a little bit more about, we discussed the assessment going on. Can you give us the timetable, everything that's, I know you're looking to select a consultant now, but give us the timetable of what you expect and what we should expect to hear from you, when we should expect to hear back with a report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, as you heard earlier, we're getting pretty close to making a selection on this first phase, which includes the actual physical assessments of the buildings. We're also working on putting out a second RFP for what we consider the second phase of this task, and that is developing the FCI scores for the use of prioritization. And we're hoping to have that on the streets very quickly so that if it ends up being a separate consultant from the consultant that's performing the phase 1 task, those two can work hand in hand and collaborate to make sure that they have all the information that they need in order to perform each task. But for phase 1, we're anticipating contract execution by August, and immediately go into training with them to get their staff on the same page, to make sure that all of these assessments that are happening concurrently are approached in the same way. And we're looking for deliverable, or at least the first deliverable back late this year, sometime in December. We might have to go back to them and ask them to make some tweaks to that deliverable, or revisit some of the sites potentially when we see things that don't necessarily make sense to us. And then with that being said, we're hoping that sometime in the first quarter of next year that we're going to get the deliverable back, or at least the first draft of the deliverable back on the FCI scorings for the prioritization, so that we can start having those discussions and present some kind of a list to you by, the following year to start the appropriation process.
So the question that I would have, we're going to be developing these FCI scores based on a new methodology, correct? So new formulas. Have you tested those formulas based on our existing data? Make sure we, there's no glitches in our formula. And
Mr. Chairman, I think There might have been a little confusion there. We're actually using the same formula, which is the deferred maintenance divided into the replacement cost value to determine what those FCI scores are. I think that the approach for us is that we want to have an opportunity to use some of our historic data and costs that we've experienced, as well as local knowledge and expertise, and maybe even apply a regional factor where we've experienced increased costs, and see how those compare to whatever cost estimating tool that the consultant will be using, such as RS Means, to develop what those component and replacement costs are, as well as the deferred maintenance costs, so that we're double checking those. I think that was one of the main concerns that we heard the last go around, is that those costs weren't as reflective of what some of the actual deferred maintenance costs should have been. And so that's something that we're trying to address. We're trying to include some checks and balances to make sure that that's a useful tool as well for the districts when they're starting to plan their major maintenance, so that they have accurate estimates on what correcting some of those deficiencies should be, that'll help them plan how they're going to forecast their expenditures.
So the new formulas are not really for FCI scores. Maybe I'm confused. Is it, under the rules and regulations, we created new, is that just for major maintenance? I know there was some, at length, we talked about those new numbers.
Chairman Pappas, are you referring to the rules revisions that took place and how the weighting is going to occur?
Correct. Yeah.
Once the scores are generated?
Right.
So
Those are the concerns I am, I guess not with the actual score.
Okay.
I probably misspoke there.
Okay.
My concern is how everything gets ranked at the end, right? Sure. And I just want to make sure that those things are working correctly before we get our new numbers and try to apply the new numbers to them. And
we have done, Mr. Chairman, we have done internally some test runs, right, with the existing capacity condition and generating that consolidated with the new weightings. We've done some mock-ups of that internally just with that data, but in terms of the new data coming in, right, the newest version, the newest calculations for capacity, and then of course, the new condition scores, in terms of using that, we obviously haven't applied the new weighting to each of those to see how that shakes out. But if you're asking if we've done kind of a mock-up using that weighting once it went into place, we have internally, just to see and to make sure that visually, right, when we're more importantly, right, when we're generating that consolidated based on those weighting factors, how that is visually appearing and what that does, if that helps.
okay, and what did you find out on those mock-up runs? I mean, any glaring issues?
Not at present.
And you haven't shared that with anyone, right?
No, we have not. That we're still fine tuning that internally.
Okay.
It hasn't been something that we've pushed out the door.
Okay. Well, I just when we start applying new FCI scores and later on in the beginning of next year, I don't want any big surprises. Districts will be screaming if we have some big surprises that we put out without some advanced knowledge. So, okay, well, maybe it's just my concern. I don't know, but I know there's others that have those concerns as well. Senator Landon.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. John, really appreciate your thoughts today. And I wondered, I want to come back to what the director brought up, which is this conceptually, this middle ground piece. And I'm even more intrigued now than I was day before yesterday, because yesterday when we toured a school that frankly was on the list, and fairly high up on a list to replace at one time, what I saw with what they were able to do just by simply going through that building and renovating it, wow. I was absolutely blown away by Park School. And it's in my community and I had not been there. So I was really taken by that. And I just wonder where we go from here as a select committee with respect to an ask out of the department. As we do an evaluation, it would be helpful to me, for example, we have several schools out across the state that we know are going to need our attention in one way or another. But it's almost like it would help me to say, look, if we tear this thing down and build a whole brand new building, this is what that's going to take. But if the bones are good enough, and we can renovate that building and turn a Park School around like that, I'd be interested in knowing, instead of spending that $35 million, we can spend $8 to $10 million and have the same kind of impact. And by the way, we don't have to move a school out on the periphery of a community. We can keep it right in its location. Does that make sense? And I wonder, how do you bring that into the fold? Have you talked about that as a staff yet? How do you bring that piece in?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, I would say that our intent with the assessment this round, right, the information and the data that we get back will help with what you're alluding to there, in terms of we'll have, you know, on the on-site physical inspection, what's going on with each of those components and systems within that building, but then separately, all of the information associated, that cost estimating associated that generates that FCI score. That's actually something that I think potentially could be used to kind of highlight or put together a number to say, for this building, we're looking at what would it take to do a renovation, right, and get that up to today's standards or in great condition, right? I think that we've had a little bit of internal conversation on these couple items, but I think the intent for us and looking at it that way is to say that we're hoping that not only is the assessment generating that FCI score, but the underlying data and information that is actually being provided by that is something that we can use for potential other purposes like that.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that, and thanks for keeping that, you know, in the back of your minds as we go forward. I don't know how the rest of the committee feels about that, but it's very intriguing to me to wonder if there isn't some other kind of list that can begin to be developed, knowing that these are the facilities that we don't think we need to tear completely down. We think we can go a different route with those. And I don't know if we need a separate presentation of those or how we go about doing that, Mr. Chairman, but I think it would really be valuable to me to know what the difference is.
Well, this conversation really hits on one of the topics that we had for this interim, right?
Yeah.
And that's, you know, in the past, we've had plenty of money where we just replace schools, right? And well, we don't have those funds anymore. And so if we're going to look at facilities, we really need to look at them hard as far as what it costs. Some of them are going to have to be replaced.
Right.
Some of them will, but not all of them will have to if the structure is okay. But we have to come up with a number, because some of them, for instance, when we went to Pineview, you know, their electrical system is, you know, they can't run half the building. They're popping circuits all the time, and they've got IT closets that are on their stage, and I mean, there's and the configuration, and we have to look at functionality or suitability, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And so some of those schools just will not function correctly, never will. But they have to be done on a case-by-case basis, and Some we'll have to replace and some we will not. But I think we have to look at those that will be able to be extended for another 25 years if we can put 10 or $15 million into them and extend them for 20 or 30 years. I think it's probably where we need to go. And the only way to do that is assess these facilities. And frankly, we're probably gonna have to have more help as far as once we identify these old facilities, that do we replace or do we remodel and rejuvenate? Okay, we need some hard, good cost estimating done. So that's probably another contract you'll have to put out and to give us that data, because we're going to have to make those decisions. Senator Rothfuss.
Well, thank you, Senator. Before we go over to you, I was just going to put one final comment on there. You know, I think that whole idea of these neighborhood schools intrigues me a lot, because I've heard from so many districts who say, you know, we really need to replace this school, but we wish we could still have it in the place that it's in. Well, that allows us to maybe do some of that too. Keep those neighborhood schools in place, and instead of having to throw them all the way out on the periphery somewhere. So anyway, go ahead.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, tacking on to what the good senators discussing about trying to prioritize, and I agree that we saw a good example of a few $1 million really changing a school and making it far more educationally suitable, and hopefully it'll last a while. But at the end of the day, there are sound reasons, as the chairman was saying, to close a school and rebuild versus continuing, or a variety of in-betweens.
Mm-hmm.
And as we're doing that estimate, I mean, there's a reasonable financial logic to just doing the calculation of, all right, how much longer should this school reasonably exist based on what we know about it. There'll be a cost associated with extending it 5 years, 10 years, 25 years. Some of our schools probably could be extended 50 years. And it all depends on the bones of the school. But those are the types of calculations we need to be looking at on behalf of the people of the state of Wyoming. Isn't just the today lowest cost. We talk about this all the time. But over the next 50 to 100 years for the fleet of schools in the state of Wyoming, what is the best approach that incorporates both keeping cost low and keeping educational services high? The data that we're getting on each school, I think, needs to get an additional information, as the chairman was laying out, that allows us to make that calculation for each school. And even maybe plan at this point in time, have an idea of, this is a school that probably will need to be replaced in 5 years. This is one that probably will make it 25 years. Wouldn't it be nice if that were the way our planning was done, rather than just a list where things bubble up to the top, but a comprehensive strategy where we could see what was coming and then try and shift things a little bit, so that rather than having a $400 million year where we need to build a lot of things, we can actually plan ahead for the budget and smooth projects over time and create some stability, not just on the major maintenance side, but on the new CapCon side. You know, that's the holy grail of these evaluations, that I've never felt we've had enough information at the end of the exercise to know how we should plan the entire fleet. And then it gets to what Senator Landon was talking about. It's even more complicated than that, because when you start looking at the local scale, I can't just close this school for a couple of years until I have the next school. So we have to be really thoughtful about how to integrate it into the local resource plan as well. So again, as we're contemplating what goes into this report and what we need to bring back, as we're sending folks out into the field, this analysis on a school-by-school basis of what does it take to last 5 years, 25 years, 50 years, what are the costs going into that? And then we'll compare that to a new build, and hopefully we'll have a better plan.
Yep.
Mr. Chair
Director.
and Senator, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. So thank you. We welcome that conversation. Putting $400 million out on the street in your example in Wyoming preference isn't doing anyone any good. You're choking your own bid climate out, and you're adding each project exponentially millions of dollars on bid day and probably one bidder. So we would welcome the flow instead of the cog and then the flow again. What you're hearing Valerie and John talk about, and that's why when I brought up the, can we talk about a renovation program, even if it's in a pilot. The reason we broke up the strategy into assessing the buildings first, they're existing, and they'll tell us how tired they are. While we're doing that, we can have these conversations. The phase 2 FCI score person, just kind of throw a vision out there. Here's a FCI score that puts you in a new school remedy, because you'll always need a new school remedy, but you can't do 400 of them right now. And then this might be an FCI score that puts you in a renovation remedy, right? And so now you can see that renovation remedy. You look at your major maintenance, you're allowed to dovetail major maintenance with a renovation remedy. Because, you know, the $15 to $18 million school is now $30 million. So if you do 4 schools for $120 million, land acquisition's going up, landfill is out of sight right now. I would bet when you add that up, you would get about every 5th school's free, if you can look at it that way. So that's the vision, and that's what we're proposing, to have some conversation about it. Thank you.
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In this same line of reasoning, would that also allow for the state to guide the Mercer studies versus the district, and if the state was contracted with had one contract for Mercer studies, to get some economies of scale across the state, and then be able to do, as the good senator from Laramie was discussing, that long-range planning of, should this school stay in circulation for 20 or 30 years longer? What should occur? And if the state was the lead on those Mercer studies holding that contract, would that allow for better planning?
Mr. Chair and Representative Walters, what you would get from that process, if we went that route, is consistency. Instead of 10 different districts doing it 10 different ways, and we could report that out to you. Secondly, we could do an RFP for a 4-year window that's renewable every 2-year contract-wise, and we're going to get economies of scale. If someone knows that they are the one who's going to do the next 5, for example, I think there might be a better price point on there. So it's good to be, I would consider that. I think that's for the immediate what can be brought to the table. There'd be the consistency in doing them, a better price point, and therefore our story and how we put it together and how we bring it to you in the commission would be more consistent. Just the 3 or 4 that I've seen or been part of since I've been here, they're just really all over the map.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Follow up, and this is for our LSO staff. Would we need a statutory change of any kind to allow for a statewide Mercer contracting system where the state guided that process versus the district by district? Or would that be more of a rule change within the School Facilities Commission?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, I haven't researched that issue, but I don't think that there's anything in statute that would prohibit the State Construction Department from taking ownership in that endeavor, sort of a statewide Mercer contractor. But I could certainly review the statutes for that. One thing I would mention is that the State Construction Department engages in a fairly extensive facility planning process with all the school districts, and that does include a facility by facility, building by building analysis. And so it's not just the prioritized list that comes to you. Historically, the department has brought forward projects that weren't necessarily at the top of the list, but through the facility planning process, they felt like it was a priority to address. And of course, just districts come to you as well, but I thought it was important to mention that in the context of your discussion.
Yeah, I too agree that the process should actually be at the state level instead of the district level. These studies have to have more consistency. I've seen them all over the planet as well, and frankly, if they're directed by the state, I mean, we're the ones that are funding these facilities. the district certainly does fund portions of it in their enhancements, but you know, basically they're state dollars, and we should be the folks
Mr. Chair.
contracting for these studies and then taking that data and using it.
Mr. Chair, when we were the school facilities department, my understanding, when you go back to historical, is we had a person who looked at land, only land acquisition throughout Wyoming. Are we paying too much or not? We also had a person who did Mercers. That's what I was told. That was their job. And then as the money started to flow on the first part of the billions, we were outsourcing it because we didn't have enough people to do it. And then when we were in full, the full 3-4 million, as it's all hitting the street, then the department couldn't keep up on that, is my understanding. And then we started allowing district, so that we weren't the cog in the wheel slowing them up until we could get out there. That's the way it's been expressed to me. So really it'd be bringing back in-house something that, as far as I understand, was already in-house.
Okay. Okay, yes, Representative Walters.
For clarity, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, are you promoting the idea of another employee to do the Mercers in-house, or do you like the subcontracting method where you would subcontract, or you would contract with someone to do them on your behalf? I guess I'm trying to determine which way do you think is more, if we go to a state controlling all of Mercer studies, which way is more efficient, having a contractor do it with you reviewing their work, or having somebody in-house, or is it a combination thereof?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Walters. My suggestion for our department at this point, we have a lot of new people. I just kind of went over that in the staffing. We've lost some historical knowledge. What I think is that we should RFP that. We should go with the consultant and the district, and I would start out in that way. You know, I still think I still look at the 9 people, counting one shared, that the school facilities division has to encompass the state right now, and it's daunting, the work that they do over there. So I wouldn't want to choke that, but I think that for the consistency standpoint, we put an RFP out, we put out expectations, they go out, we go along with them, we at least learn the process, the district is with us, and I think that's a good 3-part approach, 3-prong approach, where we have the subject matter expertise, but then we go, and but I do think we should hold the contract.
Can you tell me too, on the other side, on the construction management division, whether there's a need for Mercer studies there, and whether both the divisions can we can put the work together under one contractor?
Yeah, so the construction management division going through this state building commission is an entirely different setup. They have level 1 and level 2s for the colleges and what have you, and those are addressed in that way. The equivalent of the Mercer study, is that the right land, is that the right whatever, those studies are done in a very different way on that side of the house. So I don't think we get, I like the idea, but I don't know we get that kind of economies of scale. And each of the 50-some agencies are responsible budgetarily for doing their own study, their own level 1, level 2.
Maybe we need to look at that on that side of the house as well. But because we need to start discussing a little bit about a single procurement contract. Maybe they ought to be looking at that as well. So, but since I'm sitting on that as a liaison, maybe I can speak to them a little bit about it. We'll see. So why don't we talk about, unless anybody's got any more questions on that, should we, let's talk about the single procurement contract issue. Again, one of our priorities here.
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, what we're talking about is the appropriation.
Appropriation,
on a
correct.
single line item?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Correct. Right now, we're funding basically design and then construction in a separate appropriation. And one of our tasks is to look at providing a single appropriation for the whole enchilada. So.
Gotcha. Mr. Chairman, I think that there are advantages and disadvantages to doing it both ways. I believe I could lay out some of those advantages and disadvantages if you like that. I've noticed over the years that I've been with the school facilities department that we've seen a little bit of both. We've had some appropriations where design and construction came on a single line item. We've had appropriations in the same biennial budget that had two separate line items, one for design, sometimes potentially three, one for land, one for design, and one for construction. And then we've had appropriations spread out over multiple bienniums where we got design appropriations in one session, followed by a construction appropriation in another. I think that one of the advantages of doing the design appropriation on in a separate budget year is that you don't have to tie up as many funds in order to have a project shovel ready by the time you're ready to appropriate the construction funds. But it can be a little bit problematic because the time of the year for the construction appropriations isn't always conducive to the best time of the year to let those bids out on the street. And so potentially to get the best pricing or to begin the project, thank you, at an appropriate time. It's probably the first time I've had somebody tell me that I wasn't speaking loud enough. It can either add cost or it can add issues to the construction timelines, because then you might be constructing over the course of one summer and 2 winters, which adds to general conditions. Or you can suffer delays by having to hold on to that to let it out onto the street, you know, during the best time for bidding to realize the best costs. I think another advantage to having both of the construction and the design appropriations let at the same time is it becomes more real for the owner. They know that they've got money available and that the project is going to happen, and so they get a little more excited about it and they pay a little more attention to it during the course of design because it's tangible. I think that part of the problem with that is that sometimes it's difficult for us to forecast what the inflation factor is going to be. And so sometimes we end up having to come back to supplement those types of budgets, and that can be a little bit troublesome as well. Sorry, I'm just trying to gather my thoughts here a little bit.
Okay.
May I add one?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, so as John was kind of alluding to, there's pros and cons of each method of providing these appropriations, and historically it has flip-flopped. I can say that through this most recent session, there were 2 projects that went through, one being the 10 Sleep School in Washakie, and that was actually appropriated as a lump sum for design and construction, whereas Little Powder was actually appropriated with demolition, design, and construction separated out. So if we're taking those as the example, right, John was kind of highlighting in what some of the pros and cons are. So if the money is appropriated as a single line item, there's that ability to, like John was saying, you know, take that project from start to finish, knowing that those dollars are there for it. It also allows for, if there's a separation between, say, design and construction, if the appropriation is set up in that manner, Functionally, if there are dollars left over in that design bucket, and it's appropriated in that manner, in that case, if we needed or the district needed to go ahead and move any leftover dollars into the construction portion of it, that takes a B11 process. It has to go through the governor's office for signature. So there are some hiccups that kind of come operationally for those types of things. There is, in terms of if appropriated separately, it does allow for some intentional timing separations like John was touching on, in terms of structuring those phases in a certain way. However, there have been instances, to my understanding historically, that some projects have actually been appropriated for design, and those construction dollars were never appropriated. So you end up with design that actually sits on a shelf, and if you actually pull those back out at that point in time, they may not be applicable. They may have to actually be redone. So there's pros and cons on each side of it.
Thank you, Valerie. Mr. Chairman, she touched on the final point that I wanted to make, and that is that can be a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because we've experienced in the past where we've had a design for a project that was shovel-ready, and then due to some circumstance that changed, whether it be demographics or enrollment or something, the project actually wasn't realized, and we never received a construction appropriation because the remedy wasn't required anymore. So it cost us a little bit of money on the front end for designing that. And we have a design that may or may not be relative anymore at the time where we need it. But it also saves us from going in and building a building that, eventually is determined that wasn't completely necessary. So there's a couple of different perspectives and ways that you can look at that. And I think just to that point, that's a determination that for each individual project that you'd have to make depending on what those circumstances were.
Okay, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So this has been a concern, and there's a couple of questions that I have that maybe we can get some follow-up data and understand better. One is how many of these like on-the-shelf projects, and we chatted about this a little bit yesterday, but going back through the records, how many are currently out there where we've done a design, and we know that there's one here in town. I don't know if there's any others. Done a design and have not followed through yet on the build. So we've got at least one. But if there are others, I thought we were done with them, actually, which is why I'm explicitly asking. I thought Slade was the last one, and now I find out that we've got one here too. So that's the first question. The second is associated with that, though, that the suggestion that we've, in some circumstances, decided not to build the building because we changed our mind or the circumstances on the ground changed. Has that ever really happened? I mean, I can see where hypothetically that could happen, but I don't know that it has happened where during that 1 year or whatever between the design and the build, circumstances changed so dramatically that we chose not to use that as the remedy. And in other words, the population would have had to decrease pretty significantly to the point where we didn't have the stress anymore. So do we know of any cases where we actually have officially changed our mind and not only, and basically we've gone through design, we've spent a couple of $1 million and we've said, oh, we're better off not building a school? Has that happened?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I don't know if I would necessarily say that you've changed your mind. I think that some of the circumstances surrounding the project may have changed. Some of the enrollment may have dropped where the remedy was no longer necessary. There might have been, and this is speculative because I only know of a few instances. I'm sure there's more out there. If I had an opportunity to research it, I could probably get a lot more specific about what the reasoning or what occurred. that caused us to shelf those plans and not follow through with the project. But I know of at least 2 other projects up in Park 6, which is Cody, Wyoming, where we had designed some remodeling on a couple of elementary schools that we have a design for, but we never realized the actual construction portion of the project.
I don't see that as a problem, though, with a dual or a single appropriation. I mean, if we had a single appropriation and we decided after design we didn't want to build it, we just revert the money. I mean, I don't see an issue there. Senator Rothfuss.
And following up, yeah, I agree with that. I honestly don't see the other side of the separation where we gain advantage from 2 separate appropriations. I see all advantage on having a single appropriation because we still can stop at any point and revert. We've done reversions plenty of times in the past. So I guess in addition to maybe what's out there and examples like you mentioned where we actually have pulled back, I'd like to kind of understand the finances. And I don't remember how much we had to spend on Slade, for example. It was probably a few $100,000 on taking the plants off the shelf and getting them up to code. Other instances where we've done similar things and backed away and come back. What has that actually directly cost us? If we can find that out, it would be handy. I don't know how easy that's going to be to find. But then we also can take into consideration that it often leads to additional project cost due to inflation and opportunity cost lost, obviously, for the students as well. So I just want to understand a little bit better what's happening with that. And I've obviously been a fan over the years of just if we're going to fire on a project, you just push that project forward, and then we're just thoughtful about how much each project costs. Getting them all in parallel has wrapped ourselves around the axle seemingly a few times. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. And is that reasonable to kind of get that information and do a little historical look and see where we've done this and how it's turned out?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I think we can pull up that information and get it to you.
Thank you.
One thing I would just add, and it might have been an extenuating circumstance at a time when we were really hot and heavy and rolling out quite a bit of money. If you were limited on the amount of funds that you wanted to appropriate in a year, or if you were concerned at all about maybe over allocating and overburdening the existing and available resources and workforce, that you would want to spread that out a little bit, but you could still provide funding for some of those designs. So as you were forecasting your expenditures, those projects would be shovel ready at the appropriate time. It may be a very limited circumstance where that actually becomes an advantage, but I could see it happening.
Follow-up?
Brief follow-up. It seems like most of the times that I recall where we've done the shelving after the planning has actually just been due to the FCI score reshuffle. And the fact that we then had it, and we know that there's some variation in those FCI scores from year to year that are just based on, we came up with a slightly different answer, but if this is what happened with Slade, it fell back down a few places. Well, it was here, and that's why it was ready. That's why we had the plans drawn up, and then we did an FCI score, and the same building scored a little bit better, and then you wait 5 years.
Yeah, or it could be political whims of some legislators.
In some circumstances, whims of legislators.
Yes, we've seen funding pulled because of that.
Yep.
Representative Walters.
I'll wait.
Okay. So, okay, well, just to give my thoughts on it, yes, I agree that there's plus and minuses for each method. My perception and my many years in actually designing and constructing schools through my firm, I've seen more instances where the dual appropriation has been harmful, where a single appropriation would not be. And I know there's instances where, yeah, a dual appropriation makes sense, but in almost every case 90% of the cases, a single appropriation, I believe, is more expedient, number one. And number two, will eventually become less costly to the state. I've seen too many projects that have gone through, as was mentioned, 2 winter construction seasons, and when you've got to do heat, protect and spend money for heating and winter protection, it's a cost we don't have to do if we're able to get these projects out at the appropriate time. And to move money from a design contract to a construction contract to a land purchase contract, why we would have 3 appropriations and have leftover money and have to go to the governor and ask for a B11, it just doesn't make any sense. To the legislature, if we're going to appropriate $30 million for a project, we don't care if it's design, construction, land, whatever it is. We don't care. So why we may put that differentiation in the appropriation, I don't know. So I would suggest that we pursue some I don't know what kind of statute changes are required, if any, but pursue the idea that a single contract would be our model, would be our go-to way to do it, but allow flexibility if there's a reason to ask for a dual appropriation. I imagine we need to speak to our appropriators, right? And see if they agree. But anyhow, that's my thoughts. I just think it's a more functional and efficient way to provide. It's the way it's basically done in the private sector as well. Now, a lot of people will say, well, we don't know how much that construction money is until we actually have the design, or at least 35% design, or even 10% design. But frankly, I think we know, we've got enough history, I think, and we can forecast inflation, hopefully, correctly, that we can come close. And so I don't think it's an issue. I don't think that argument really is pertinent. Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we have 2 conversations happening here. One is, when we appropriate the money, do we break it up? Land acquisition, demolition, construction, design. That is one part of this conversation. The other part of the conversation is, once we have committed to a project, do we fund the design, construction, and demolition all at the same time, so that we don't end up with plans on the shelf? That's the second. So I think we're talking about, or intermingling 2 different conversations here. On the first one of breaking up the project, I kind of like the idea of breaking it up in the land acquisition is one component that we get to look at. Design is one component, construction is one component, and demolition would be one component. And I like that breaking up, because that way the state benefits from any cost savings. So if they're able to, if you put it all into one lump sum, here's $20 million, go do the best work you can with that. The district can then get a good deal on the land and a good deal on the design and the demolition, and build more school than maybe the state was wanting to build for that district. Whereas if we know what each one of those components pieces are, the state again gets to see the cost savings. Since the state is the one providing the money, the state should be the one benefiting from any cost savings. So I like seeing those separated out. For the second part of the conversation, where we're discussing, once we decide we're going to commit to a project, so we're going to fund it, and it's going to include land acquisition, design, construction, and demolition, all of that. If once we commit to that project, there is an issue of dollars and profiling of those dollars. If we say in 2022 budget session, for example, we want to do this entire project and it costs us $20 million, we have taken some of that money off the table, knowing, so it cannot be used for any other design work, because we've committed to that project, knowing that part of that project may not take place until 2024, because it's going to take this year to get the land acquired. It's going to take some of next year to actually do the design work. And 2024 is when we're going to put a shovel in the ground and tack up the first 2x4. And so, but we have already in this year committed all 20 million of that dollar value. And so that money that could have, that, if we break those up a little bit, then we're able to design 2 or 3, we'll do some land acquisition for 2 or 3 projects this year with that 20 million, do some additional design, and actually do some construction on a project we started a couple years ago. And so there is an advantage in the way the legislature and the way the state profiles its dollars to breaking these up. I think the real crux of it is, how do we say, without telling our future members what they will be doing, is how do we say we have committed to this project and we will fully fund it as it comes through, and knowing that we may have to put other things on the side burner if our revenue streams change, but knowing that once we give that nod, we're ready to commit full-heartedly to it without profiling 100% of those dollars in year one. And so I think that is really where the 2 components is where this conversation needs to lead, and how do we make sure we do that? Because I agree with the previous comments that we don't want to have plans sitting on the shelf. And so all of that was a statement to lead up to my question for the good director, and that is, if we were to fund it all in one session, we'd break it up into the various components of the project, but we do it all in one session, and then you do the design work and get to a point of, this just isn't feasible, this doesn't make sense because we've had 5 coal mines close, and so where we saw an increase in student population, we're going to see a huge decrease over the next 5 years. Would you, as the department and the commission, be able to say, okay, legislature, we want to pull back on this project, and be willing to be the ones that pull the plug instead of us be the ones to pull the plug?
Mr. Chair, Representative Walters, thank you for that. Now, but that's exactly, I think, what I understood happened in the case of the Pineview Elementary School. It was a 2-step. It was designed in one, $2-3 million spent on design, what have you. New scores come around, new scrub data from WDE, new ADM. Oops, you don't qualify for that anymore, and then it goes off to the side. So that's the challenge, and I appreciate this conversation. I would say to you, on this con list about doing it in either in 2 steps or you're in the money, then you're out. I'll just put my former district executive hat on, and there's probably some behind me who are going to feel the same way. If I think I'm in the money for a new school because I've been given the architect money, if I'm proactive, I heard the comment many times yesterday, gosh, we could hear about this in a meeting, we could see it on a sheet of paper, but now I'm actually living it, right? We on the school side have to live that. And when we hear we're in the money, if we're proactive, we start telling the Board of Ed, they start holding community meetings. We start talking about boundary changes, which are inflammatory. They're always, what's going to happen? Who's going to come? Who's going to go? We might even start getting into the bus routes and how that's going to change. We start up a process in preparation of this that then gets shelved, and here we are, right, on the district end, if I'm being the district person, and that's a tough place to be. The other is when I'm in charge of facilities and maintenance, and I think I'm in that new remedy that's coming just 2 years out now. I start cutting back on my major maintenance. I start doing some of my other ones, because after all, this school is going away here, and then that turns out not to be. So those are just some of the cons that I wanted to put out there. And then, of course, what's been discussed here is I don't know that construction's ever cheaper, right? The longer you wait. But I think we have mechanisms in place, and Valerie can talk about them, in terms of how we look at enrollment. I do think a definitive go, no-go decision should be done through the commission, through the department, and the select committee. So when you are told you can do planning, it might be deferred a bit out, but you're not having it pulled from you, and then figuring out what to do next. And I would be in favor in a conversation of that nature.
So Representative Walters, I do agree in part with your first part of that. However, I think the intent is to keep all those pieces separate, right? The demolition, the land purchase, all that. But the department would have control over those dollars, not the district. So we're not going to give the district $30 million and then I see that the department, and if the department doesn't use all the dollars, it would revert. but those still all can be in a single appropriation like your second part. So I think I think you'd be okay. So, Senator Rothus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I understand and agree with Representative Walters' desire to do it that way, but I honestly don't think we can because of the fact that we can't bind future legislatures and future legislators. When we look at the past decade, we know that when we partially fund, or if we speculatively fund, we claw back. That's the nature of how it works, right? It just means fight it about it again next year. It's all on the table. And I don't know any mechanism that works in any rational way other than a one-time appropriation towards a single project. That seems to work well. And even then, we could claw it back if it weren't used yet, but it's harder. So I'm sensitive to the same considerations, and I do think it's cleaner from the ensuring that the state benefits and the savings if we did have, 4 line items or something along those lines. But at the end of the day, the single appropriation for a project allows us to do what I think is our obligation, which is not to bind future legislatures. It's kind of the reverse of it, right? We can't do it, but we also shouldn't do it. And if we can't afford to run the full project at this time because we've got money in hand for a CapCon project, if we're not willing to fire the entire project and appropriate for it, we probably shouldn't, realistically. So from that side, I think the single appropriation is the appropriate approach. Now, is there a way to structure the language when we're writing the budget bill that says something along the lines of, this aggregate sum represents 4 appropriations, where these 4 appropriations are 1, demolition, 2, land acquisition, 3, planning, and 4, construction, and maybe the funds are broken up? You could do that. But I do think that at that point, people would look at it the next year and say, well, clearly these funds haven't been spent yet, so we can claw them back. So those are my thoughts.
So my thoughts on that is that, number one, we're really getting into the micromanaging of the project by doing that. And I think we can have those line items, but at the department level, not at the appropriations level. So, if we decide that we're going to spend $27 million on a school, we'll spend $27 million. We don't care whether it's in land, whether it's in, we shouldn't care, I should say. That should be an issue at the department level. And so those line items can be there, but they'll deal with it, not the legislature.
Mr. Chairman, if I can add that in terms of putting together the budgets and the projects that are going to move forward that then go to joint appropriations, we do internally put together budgets for each project once a need is identified, and that's what we're going to move forward with. So we do internally separate out, how much is land purchase, how much is demolition going to cost, or whatever that project actually entails. So we have that internally. It's just something that isn't necessarily provided to you all, essentially that line by line, including contingencies or plan reviews or any of those types of things, right? We actually do budget for a project in that manner, but it'll come to you as it's an elementary school, and it'll come to you as a lump sum to say $26 million for a project. And that won't change internally, regardless of the way that you actually appropriate, if that helps.
Mr. Chairman?
Co-chairman.
I appreciate having a current appropriator, but even more so, I appreciate having 2 former and reformed appropriators on the committee. And I would just be slightly interested if they would be willing to opine on this. As a reformed appropriator, I think they bring a unique perspective to this. And so I'd be curious of the 2 former appropriators' thoughts on this.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You want me to?
Representative Harshman.
Well, I think it's been outlined, but I think part of the problems you toured yesterday are our current system. That's why Park was taken care of, because it was on and off, not once, but 3 times. It was scheduled to get redone 3 times. And finally, the district's gone through all this, and the people and the parents, and it's like, okay, we're gonna do something. So that's part of the problem, our current system, and the couple $1 million on design at the other school. You know, those designs aren't good forever. So I think, you know, there's advantages to kind of stretching it out and get more in the pipeline, but when you cut the pipeline off, you waste taxpayers' dollars. And I think we got to be really careful. So I think looking back, and, you know, I don't know, I've served on this committee probably 16 years. I think it's, I've kind of changed my mind. I think I'm more, once you're in, and let's appropriate it. And pipeline looks different, maybe less projects in it, but we get it moving forward. I think it'll actually be more cost effective moving forward. That's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Senator Landon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the co-chairman for asking. It has been a privilege to serve on both the Select Committee and Appropriations, and I really take to heart what Representative Walters has pointed out, which is we do like to keep an eye on things, especially when we're appropriators. We want to know, are we keeping our pencils sharp? Are we doing the right thing here? What was this land acquisition before we pull the trigger on some design? We want to know, do you have this? So I get that piece, and I appreciate those cautions. But honestly, having served as the chairman of this committee and watched as we have left projects back, I've used the analogy of the Oregon Trail before, where we've been in our wagons and away we go west. And a couple of times over the last handful of years, we've been able to say to each other, you know, we left Tinsley back there by the piano. We had to throw it off the wagon. Let's go back and get it. Having witnessed and taken part in all of those fits and starts that we've had, including Slade and including Pine Bluffs and all these different schools that we have expended funds for, and then for one reason or another had to shelf those. I share the concern of Chairman Harshman, which is, you know, that's not very good use of taxpayer dollars. We toured a grade school yesterday, Mr. Chairman, that we had already expended the design funds, and that shelf life is running out. And that was, I think, $2.5 million that we heard from the school district. So given all of that, it sure makes sense to me that if we're going to approve a project, let's approve it. Get it going and make that commitment so that the school districts out across know that when we make that commitment, we mean it. And so that's what
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you. So I appreciate both the former appropriators and then, of course, your length of time that all three of you have been on this committee. I really appreciate your guys' input on this. I think what the former chairman here was just saying is kind of where I'm at with this. You know, and I think what I also see is situations where we've had it happen here, and I know I just heard the former speaker from up here has had it happen in his community, that you have a situation where it boils up to the top and then we have to replace something, then it goes back down, and we don't use the replacement. We don't go build the new school. We just replace the roof or 16 windows or whatever the case was, or a boiler, and it knocks it back down, and then we've wasted that amount of money. While I understand the intents and purposes of trying to slow things down, I mean, that's the case for bureaucracy, right? Is to try to slow things down and make sure we're doing the right decision. It's actually cost us valuable resources for our children. And what I look at is we're talking about money, but at the end of the day, we're actually talking about where these kids are going to school and where they're learning. And I think it's really easy for us behind this dais to get caught up in money and making sure that we're saving this dollar here or that dollar there. Well, I can tell you that if anybody, when we get the chance to come down to Cheyenne, if wants to go tour ARP Elementary, where this has boiled up and come down and boiled up and come down, I'd be more than happy to take you out there and show you what's happened. And I think it's at that point that, as the two former appropriators have talked about, you have to get the parents involved, and the parents have to get mad for something to happen, and they start contacting us as legislators, and then we start having to force it down. It looks like a political move, and it shouldn't be a political move. We're just trying to take care of our kids and take care of the buildings that our kids are learning in. So I do think that this was one of my big pushes on this committee this year, was to take a look at the single appropriation and get it moving and get it solidified, because I think that we're wasting time and valuable resources by waiting for extra years. And clearly it's this case when we're going to see $6 to $8 million more appropriating because of inflationary costs just in this budget. So I do appreciate the input. I don't really have a question. That was more of my just opinion on this, but it does sound like we're moving in the direction that I would like, but that's not to say I don't appreciate my good colleague here to the left as well.
Okay, Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm also in that same position. I think the people that need to take care of that money are sitting right there, and they're the ones that are going to make sure everything's in order before they go the next step. We got to trust that and let them go. When we take the money and then we want to hold it up, all we're doing is costing taxpayer money pretty drastically. Once we've made a decision to go with it, give them the money, let them take care of it. They'll make sure it's right, and we'll move forward. It makes more sense in my mind.
Well, I get the sense from this conversation that the committee is leaning towards a single procurement appropriation. Again, I think whatever we do, allow an exception for the department, and if there's a reason for a dual appropriation, to submit it that way. But so is there any more conversation on this?
I think one, I guess I would ask myself, if we're on the select committee, what's my downside? That school we visited yesterday could have been funded at those construction dollars back in the day. If your statute said you fund school by school, and you built that 400 student school, and it was only 200 because enrollment dipped, that would be one thing. But your statute says it's district wide. So when the school comes to you for another one, you say, until you fill that 400 up, we got nothing to talk about. So I don't know what the downside is, really, if I would look at it from that perspective.
Okay. Yeah, Senator Landon.
Just a couple of things, and appreciate that, Director. I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is we have, through the years, been able to put some schools in the pipeline. And I think John alluded to that. You're able to get some things started and saying, hey, we haven't forgotten you. You're in the pipeline, and away you go. We give you the design money. So up front, we're going to be spending quite a bit more money to pay for these projects, and we won't necessarily have as many projects in the pipeline. So I think we all know that. I mean, if we go to a different way of looking at it. But my question, Mr. Chairman, is are you looking for the motion for a bill draft? And I'm looking over at Tanya to see what her thoughts might be, if that's okay with you. Does this take a bill draft?
I was actually going to go to staff for their comments. So Tanya, any
Chairman,
thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, there is a statute that would need to be modified to accommodate this approach. It's 2115-119C. It's a bit unclear, but the notion is contemplating that when the budgets come forward, it is in 3 phases: planning, design, and construction. And this is the provision that restricts how much can be transferred between the design and construction. Anything outside of 15% requires the governor's approval. And certainly, that would need to be modified, but also in preparation of the supplemental budget, it would look in a different form than what you've what you historically have seen. So it would be sort of twofold. One, this is a separate bill draft, and then 2, in your appropriation, it would look differently. If you recall the bill draft that you saw last year, and it was also incorporated in the budget bill, it is, land acquisitions, demolition, planning, design, construction. It would look differently in that regard as well.
So, Matt?
Mr. Chairman, I'd also add, there is nothing that prohibits the legislature from appropriating the total amount from design and construction already. That's been done in the past. So I think the rub here is that in most cases, a design appropriation only occurs first. There's not a tailing or a like amount for appropriation that is in the same budget in most cases. The one question, I guess, is if in an amendment to the law, would you still want the commission and the department to bring forward a budget request that identifies each of those amounts? And part of my reasoning for that is when you see design costs, are there instances where one project's 20% design cost compared to another district of 10% costs? Is there some efficiency that's not being handled on a certain project? So as you contemplate amendments to statutes, do you still want to retain that the commission and the department bring these land acquisition costs, planning costs, design costs, construction costs? On the appropriation side, that's simple. We can continue to disaggregate those and make it all one, but that's a policy choice from the legislature.
So my thought on that is those individual costs, those individual light items ought to be for this committee, for the commission, and for the division to look at and work. But once it gets to the appropriators, I don't think those light items ought to be there. It just, again, they'll start micromanaging the projects, and I think they ought to be an all-in cost to them. Certainly we can answer, if an appropriator has a question on those line items on a particular project, we can give them that information. It's not going to be hidden from them. But to provide it to them so that they can make a comparison from project to project to project to project, I think is not productive for their time and creates, I think, more problems. Matt?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up on that.
Okay.
From a transparency standpoint, the legislature used to make one appropriation of, here's $300 million for the biennium for capital construction. And the legislature did not tie a specific appropriation for either, capital construction, design. And there's been this lack of, we hear projects that are on and off the list. It's hard as your staff and even, I think, department staff to go back to say what was really contained in that appropriation, because as amendments occur to the budget, they occur on a project level basis. They don't occur on a statewide basis. The legislature is notorious for making changes to the budget on a project by project basis. And so as you think about this process in appropriations, are you looking at a total appropriation on a project basis, a district basis, a statewide basis? And I'm not cautioning you, I'm just giving you some historical perspective that the state used to just give it one number, but there is a lack of transparency or ability for your staff and for the department staff to go back and look at the records. What was contained in that appropriation? Because we don't know. We changed that process at about 2009, 2010 to make it a project by project appropriation, because we can't go back and say, well, Cary Junior High School was appropriated for design in 2005. We don't know that because we don't know the details of the budget.
I think the intent is not to remove the project by project basis. The intent is to, when that project gets appropriated, it's a single appropriation for the entire project. Land, demolition, construction, and design, all of that in one number. Each project can still have its line item in the appropriation bill, because frankly, that's you'll never get away from that, I don't think. Individual legislators want to see their projects in there, and that's part of the political process. But the whole topic is about putting those four pieces, those four parts of the project into one appropriation. Not one lump sum appropriation for all the projects, but that each project has a single appropriation. That's all we're getting at.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I think I can see it's much easier on the design and construction side. The land and the planning are, the planning drives that design and construction cost. The land occurs at infrequent opportunities when the commissioner of the department see an opportunity for a piece of land that could be built on in 20 years from now. They take those opportunities to purchase it at that point. So I think that.
I think I agree. Land and demolition could probably be separate as well. But design and construction need to be together. So I think Representative Hutchins, did you have a question? Or Senator Hutchins, excuse me? Did you have your hand up? No, okay. All right. Any more comment on this?
Mr. Chairman, I think, based off of the discussion, I think we do want a bill draft. Since we're just looking at a bill draft, I don't think we need to vote on that, do we? Or we do, okay. But that being said, I do think that would allow us to at least have this discussion in a little more depth at our next meeting.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
I'll say two things. First of all, we should probably have this discussion over lunch and really contemplate it further. But second of all, I'd actually say, based on the conversation, that we don't need a bill draft. So let's talk about that over lunch also, because I feel like we still want everything that Tanya described, and we don't need it when we're drafting our own legislation. We just want to receive it. So I feel like we might not need it, but let's work that out over lunch too. Yeah, great.
Okay. That being said, I do want to open this topic and any of the staffing topic that we talked earlier as well to public comment after lunch. You guys want to take the public comment after lunch? Let's do that. Okay, we'll do that. Well, is there anybody who, everybody, you're gonna, okay, we'll take, there, the sound, looks like some folks can't stay till after lunch.
If you prefer to do it later, that's fine.
You're good with that? All right. No, we're going to take public comment after lunch because it's getting late. All right. So committee, how long do you want to take for lunch? Are you good for just 1 hour? Okay, so we'll be back here at 1:30. Thank you.
Let's go to Rockets. That sounds like it.